first part. We're going to spend about roughly 30 minutes on kind of an overview of the plans and kind of getting to the workshop part, if you will, of this. So I'll turn it over to them.
And I think Kyle kind of alluded to this, but a lot of this kind of overlaps. And so John and I will kind of go back and forth here. So get ready for a little in the round here. But so a quick overview of the Metropolitan Transportation Plan. So every 5 years, the MPO is required to do an update to the transportation plan. It's always looking out at least 20 years. So we're looking out through the year 2050 for this plan update. It's multimodal in nature. So we're looking at bicycle, pedestrian, vehicular, freight movement, transit. All of that is part of this plan. And then, we're looking for specific strategies and projects. What should we consider after we get through kind of our first fact finding part? What are the needs and what are some of the, solutions that might work? Here's one of the key parts of this. You'll see this later on. We'll talk about this, but the fiscally constrained project lists, essentially what we think the MPO is responsible for, distributing the federal transportation funds in the area. And so what do we reasonably think we can use that small allotment of funds for? And then we've had the opportunity to kind of overlap all this work with that comprehensive safety action plan. And so John will talk a little bit about that as well.
Yeah, on this next slide, as it comes up here, just want to point out that the Comprehensive Safety Action Plan, it's newer. It is like the MTP, kind of guided by certain guidelines on pieces that you need to hit. It's funded by a program called Safe Streets and Roads for All, and the intent of the program set up at the federal level was to help a lot of communities to be able to do comprehensive safety planning, potentially for the first time, or at least for the first time, with that being its primary focus, and then make those communities eligible to go into future rounds of USDOT grant opportunities to develop implementation projects for dramatically reducing serious injuries and fatalities on our roads.
And I guess while I'm thinking about it, everybody online, are John and I coming through okay? Volume okay? Okay, appreciate that. So real briefly on the schedule, we've essentially been at this for about the past year. So kicked off about July last year. We're going to talk about some of those engagement milestones, some of the technical analysis that got us here, but we're really at the phase of draft recommendations, and then going through. We'll come back to you here very soon, I believe next month, and then talk about having a final adopted plan. Go to the next slide. So part of this process is kind of revisiting where we're at as a community, and through this first kind of milestone of engagement that we did. Last fall, we talked about what some of those kind of ideals were for what we should get out of our transportation system. And so kind of settled on these 5 goal areas of accessibility and connectivity, making sure we do it safely. And that overlaps really well with that safety action plan, obviously. Sustainability, efficiency, and reliability. And then placemaking, quality of life, just making sure transportation is consistent with our neighborhoods and business districts. So had a really in-depth technical analysis. I'm not going to walk through all of that because that would take quite a bit of time. But if you had any questions about things later, we could probably answer some of them. But we looked at all kinds of things really, again, with the work the Safety Action Plan team did, really deep dive on safety and identifying some of those issues. Looking at traffic operations and congestion and reliability. Looking at the state of the assets, pavement and bridge conditions. Looking at bicycle and pedestrian connections and conditions, freight movement, transit, and how we kind of connect throughout, other places across the region. And then, making sure we're doing it, thinking about the environment that we're operating within.
And I just want to hit here again why, it made sense to conjoin these 2 plans. There's many of the program areas that the CSAP focuses on and drives more depth into are aligned with the MTP. So there's some areas where the CSAP won't go into traffic operations or some of that regional connectivity, but does end up affecting all modes. In fact, the crossover between modes and potential separation of those modes becomes a major safety issue. And even our state of repair of our assets creates a major opportunity for us to introduce safety, because maintenance projects can be safety projects too. So that really went into our philosophy and kind of putting those 2 things together.
So we talked about that kind of rigorous community engagement program that we developed. And this is the perfect opportunity to align these two plans because, you don't want to go to two separate meetings for two separate plans asking kind of the same questions. So we had the opportunity there with that first milestone, what's going on in your community? What are some of the opportunities that you see? What are some of the issues, some of the things we ought to be able to address? And that second milestone that we got through at the end of April was, talking about what are some of the solutions, what are the opportunities, what do you think about, do these make sense in our community? And so that's the two milestones. We did it through a range of different of avenues, and you can see kind of some of the illustrations here, but in-person meetings, showed up at events that were going on and kind of talked to people that were there for the farmers market and for the eco fair. Had an online presence with those online meetings and surveys, and then did a statistically valid household survey.
And could I just ask, what is it we're asking people? Could you clarify that?
Yeah. So that first round, it was, okay, so I talked about what the goals were. We're kind of getting some feedback on, okay, which of these kind of opposing goal areas, or in some cases they're complementary, but, what are most important to you as a community? And so the other things that we're asking for also are some specifics like, where do you see safety issues? Where do you see the opportunities maybe for a new connection or a new trail or, new transit services? And so that's kind of that first round. That second round is, so we've taken all that, we've kind of done our technical analysis, and that second round of engagement that we just wrapped up a little over a month ago was more of, okay, here's some potential solutions. Do you think this fits in this community? If so, where do you think it makes sense to do that? And so it's kind of focusing on the implementation of solutions.
And that's very helpful.
To that first round.
That's very helpful. And so how do we use that information in coordination with the direction that Damien's going to provide us in evaluating, because he's also evaluating our transportation system. So how does the public input and Damien's analysis sort of work in the same dish?
So I can start that, Damien, if you'd like, and you can answer for yourself.
I think that, certainly, I think one thing I would add to what Jason said, and I'm sorry that it's small, but in the bottom right hand of this corner of the slide, because this plan is built on performance measures. So the way we rank and score things based on safety, operation, all those categories we talked about. Well, we also ask the public in those categories, what are your priorities? And we give them a certain limited number of stickers, and it helps us weight all the different ways that we can score projects. And that tells us like, what are the high priority projects, what are the medium, and what are the low priority. So it just helps us put the dollars where they need to go first, second, and third, and really kind of get the most out of the system that we can that meets all the goals, not only of best practices nationally, but of what the local public is looking to see and what their expectations are.
Great, thank you.
If we go to the next slide, and then we kind of touch on maybe some of the feedback we received at each milestone right after this one. We did lead off with a statistically valid household survey, essentially surveyed just over 400 households. This is a survey that we've repeated. I know I see a couple of veterans up there. We've repeated this on past plans 5 years ago and actually going back 20 years ago. And so it's kind of interesting to see some of that, the panel data as you go across time, how different opinions on the transportation system change. You can see like, here's an example question. Are you very satisfied with the SciRide service, ease of traveling to work and shopping, getting feedback and all that. But again, you can see that it's within a range of plus or minus 5% based on that household survey. And then the next one kind of gets into an example of the type of feedback. So you saw that sticker chart on the last one. That was at one of our pop-up events, but kind of combine that also with what we heard online and, what are the most important things in the community to the public that we heard. And so, really focused. I think if you look at those top three, you see sustainability, accessibility, and then, public and active transportation were really important to the folks that we heard back through that engagement. And then the second phase, if you go to the next slide, this list gets a little bit long, but we asked and kind of illustrated a range of potential solutions and strategies for potential implementation. And so, we get a lot of that real high interest in transit services, intercity bus, people brought up the concept of a route between Ames and Des Moines, but also just, opportunities for new trails, improving and coordinating traffic signals, which, they do a great job of right now, but opportunities to kind of keep reevaluating that. And so you can see kind of this is the level of feedback, and that kind of went into the later on, you'll see the strategies and the projects that we start talking about.
On your slide that showed 20, was back 2 slides.
Okay.
Have you ever superimposed or juxtaposed 2004, 2014, and 2019 results to see if there's been a change or trends that would cause us to realize that either we're making progress or it's actually an increasing issue?
Yeah, so we do have some comparisons in the draft report that's coming out, looking at kind of how opinions changed over time. We saw, I think, particularly compared to 2019, we've seen an uptick in some of the satisfaction of transportation generally, less negative responses to all that. I think over 20 years, you'll see a few things that are repeating themes, but also over 20 years, I think we've seen maybe a little bit more issues, like somebody might say, congestion might pop up a little bit more than we would have seen maybe 20 years ago. But yeah, we've got actually some of that comparison that'll be in the final report. But yeah, that's a great opportunity and a great question, because when you do this survey all those years in a row, that's a natural comparison.
And we also, in the traffic division of Public Works, we track things like the mode share, and we also track crash histories. So we look at both on whether or not we're trending in the right direction for safety, and whether or not we're increasing the walking and biking, which was a goal that we've had for a long time. So we do track those metrics in other places on an annual basis.
Yeah, it just seems obviously if you have more traffic, you got quite a matrix of things coming in to inform, this. But I think it'd be, we do a customer satisfaction survey every year. This is a great opportunity to see, and report back. We're seeing real positive progress in this, and this, and also as council's you're looking at CIP projects. Maybe we use it to affirm or rearrange some of those CIP projects too. But anyway, so that'd be helpful to see, and we'll look forward to reading that analysis when we get the final report.
Can you also tell us roughly how many people were involved in the in-person feedback?
The in-person meet. So we had the most people that we spoke to at the Eco Fair and the Farmers Market. And I can't remember the number. It was over 100 for each, I believe.
Okay.
For both of those. And then our in-person meetings, we probably had 20 or 30 folks show up.
Okay.
This format, and that's why we need an online presence too, and we need to go where the people are.
Sure.
Because when you're doing a long range multimodal across the area plan, it's not always a natural draw for it's not like you've got a project that's controversial right next to, in a neighborhood or something. So
Right.
a lot of times we need to take that multi-pronged approach. So,
Absolutely.
but
Thank
yeah,
you.
good question.
And Damien or Kyle, can you comment on how does SciRide interface with this study? Because obviously the top 2 levels for new transit route or extension, intercity bus, obviously those are directly affected. It's actually SciRide, not necessarily us specifically. Can you kind of comment on that?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, we're working directly with SciRide on this plan, and there's a lot of parts of the plan that are transit specific. And yeah, very close coordination with SciRide's staff for those portions. So yes, we are working closely with them, and a lot of the transit recommendations actually come from them as far as areas for improvement and what projects they would like to see in the next 20, 25 years.
Great, thank you.
Could I ask about slide 14? It's the next slide, I think, after that was being shown. What does preservation have to do with this? When I think about preservation and transportation, I think of things like the interstate highway system destroying neighborhoods, but I'm not sure that that's really what preservation means here. So what is that?
So yeah, that's a great question. And I will point out that when we ask people their opinions on each of these, we do give a quick definition too. So you are at a disadvantage on that one. Yeah, in terms of preservation, what we're getting at is keeping the existing assets that we have out there, whether it's streets, whether it's, transit infrastructure, trails, keeping them in a state of good repair. And so how much of a focus should we be putting on taking care of what we've already, invested in? And so I will tell you that typically when we get these public surveys, we know it's really important. We have to do it. We do put the vast majority of our financial resources into preservation. It's not always at the top of lists when we get these goals responses. So we, I understand we have a duty to kind of keep preserving what we have. And so that's what that one's about.
Thank you.
And what
Yeah, good
about equity? How did you describe that in your?
Yeah, I think we probably, I wish I had that in front of me. So I think it would be offering, so I think we looked at it two ways. Typically, we would phrase it in terms of offering equal access to people regardless of who they are, and also in terms of the negative impacts of transportation. So keeping that balanced. So,
Thank you.
yeah, apologies, I don't have that right in front of me though. Are we on to the next slide maybe?
Okay.
So again, we talked about how part of this really is forward looking, and a big part of it. So we know kind of maybe what some of our shorter term needs are. We've got kind of those capital programs out there that are already kind of like queuing up the projects for the next 5 years. So we're really trying to get out in front of that with this plan. And so we're looking through the year 2050, coordinated, really closely with different data sources, got an understanding of what the Ames 2040 comp plan had in it, some of the growth patterns in Gilbert and Story County, and use some data sources. But we're looking at about 1% annual growth is our projection in the urban area. So you can see if we go to the next slide, and that's pretty consistent across households. Oh, sorry, my apologies. That'll be a couple of slides up. So basically, we've got about 25 to 30% growth in households and jobs anticipated between today and 2050. And so what's really important for this is also to kind of take our understanding of, talking with planning professionals, looking at comprehensive plans, getting an understanding of where we anticipate growth to happen. So this is showing where we anticipate, how many households and where that would happen. That's going to influence, obviously, future travel patterns. If we go to the next one, we can see where we think future jobs are going to happen. And so again, this aligns pretty well with the growth plans as a part of the 2040 comp plan for Ames and some of the thoughts for some of the surrounding communities as well.
And just for
for
clarification for people who may not be aware, would you describe the actual metro, the urban area you're talking about? What, because some people may think
that's a good question.
Well, gosh, Story County, yes, we're bigger than that. Just explain what that is.
No, that's a really good point. If we go back to the bar chart, so this is actually representing the MPO area. And so this is defined by the federal government after every decennial census based on a calculation of where the urban area is, right? And so this is essentially all of Ames, a very small portion of like a square mile or two of Boone County, a little bit of unincorporated Story County around Ames, and Gilbert. So when you see 73,910 in the year 2023, that's more than the population of Ames. It's less than the population of Story County. So places like Nevada aren't included in that. Some of the other surrounding communities in Story County. No, great question. I should have clarified that as we got on.
Thank you.
That boundary on this map shows that area,
Yep.
but
Yep.
no, that's a very good point.
It's the images are pretty small, just so people can clearly follow it. So thank you.
Yeah, no, great question. And if we go to the next slide, one more, sorry. This is the one I thought was next. So essentially, we're looking at about 27% growth in households and jobs. That's translating into a pretty close amount of more trips being made in the future. And then there's a measure called vehicle miles traveled. That's essentially, if you added up every mile of every trip everybody makes, whether they're walking, biking, taking a bus, driving, that's going to increase even more than trips. And then the amount of time spent traveling is even a little bit higher. So again, You saw we got a little bit of growth anticipated out on the fringes. Some of it's more infill, but as we continue to build out a little bit, we anticipate some trips will get a little bit longer. So
Can
So-
you articulate how do you arrive at that? Is there some kind of a model
Yes.
and that looks at,
great question.
that's
Yeah.
a dumb question. I mean,
No,
I'm sure it's a model.
it's a model.
Can you help
yeah.
us understand how?
Yeah,
they
and if you
arrived
go
at it?
back, can we go back one now too? Sorry. So you can see this is job growth. And so we've got that kind of east industrial growth area that we're anticipating some growth kind of down in that southeast quadrant, and then a little bit up north and even west. So we're actually kind of modeling this, and it's a computer software package with a model, and it basically we tune it to kind of replicate existing conditions, and then we put future growth into it and kind of see how we anticipate that change to happen.
So for example, and it's not going to happen, but if
Yep.
all the job growth was happening in the core of
Yep.
Ames,
Right.
you would take that into consideration, and then we see a lot of different numbers
We would get a
because we
different answer.
have most of the growth occurring on the perimeter that we're seeing, which I consider to be a pretty significant increase in vehicle miles being driven
Right.
in your chart. So anyway,
Yep.
Thank
Nope.
you.
That, yes. No. It takes all of that into account. Great question.
go ahead.
Well, my question dovetails with the mayor's.
Yeah.
So Peter Erasmus is the economist at Iowa State, and he always reminds us that about a third of the people who work in Ames live outside of Ames. And I don't know if that number is still accurate, but I would anticipate because there aren't housing options in Ames, and we're in essence, a lot of our affordable housing is being moved out to our surrounding communities. Just intuitively, I would presume that the number of those miles would be disproportionately greater going forward because there's just no housing options to speak of here in Ames. So could you speak to that?
Yeah. So that's a very good question. So there is probably a good piece of that 37% growth or 35% growth in VMT and 37% growth in VHT that is related to people coming from outside and traveling in. We are anticipating continued growth in that in and out of the Ames MPO area you see here, continuing into the future.
And this was a topic in our climate action planning because one of the downsides of not having housing options is that we're making people drive further to get here. So
Right.
the lady who cuts my hair does not live in Ames. She lives in Carroll.
Yeah.
So, and she would love to live in Ames. There are no options for her.
No, we are, this modeling effort anticipates that trend continues into the future. And so a lot of that growth, we aren't modeling the entire trip. Let's say it's somebody in Ankeny. We aren't modeling the whole trip from Ankeny. We are modeling them when they enter the MPO area.
Okay, thanks.
So that it could be slightly higher. And then the out commuting would be the same way. If you live here and work in Des Moines or somewhere else, it would be the same. We're counting the part of the trip that happens in the MPO box.
Yeah, thanks.
Well, one thing I would add to that, so as you can see, and that's why I think we thought it was important to point out that the model itself is consistent with the Ames comp plan. And the reason for that is because anytime you would have growth or urbanized development in a field, part of the MPO area that is not within the Ames corporate limit, we expect it to be incorporated. So that's why it's kind of governed by, and working with our City of Ames planning staff, allocate the jobs and the housing. But I think kind of what you're getting at is, so what you see here is all consistent with those assumptions that are in that plan. But what this effort doesn't do is it doesn't model all the different sensitivities that you could look at with a regional model, such as, well, what if we had all the housing growth that we expect for the population growth that we're projecting to happen in the core area of a town. I think some of that work had been done or looked at with the comp plan, those kind of like what if scenarios. I just think it's important to point out that the MTP doesn't necessarily run all those scenarios. It looks at what is the most probable scenario and runs the impacts related to it.
So that's a really good question or point too. And Tim, that's a good clarification. So if everybody in the United States is using the same model, I presume that part of this is going to justify requesting federal funds or other kind of funds or allocation for projects. Is that correct?
So, I will say the modeling process itself is rather standardized. There's a few different ways to do it, but yes, it is a federally recognized and accepted way that Ames MPO is doing their model. Yeah, and so this whole planning process basically is federally compliant, meets the Code of Federal Regulations, and continues the ability to get federal funding.
Yeah, and my question wasn't well framed, and I didn't
Yeah.
mean to imply you weren't doing something that was
Yeah.
that wasn't
No, I know.
consistent.
I could tell you
But
one.
what I was trying to get at was
Yeah.
that if we're being compared to different similar population,
Yeah.
and they used a similar type of modeling scenario, but it shows that we have more daily trips and more vehicle miles travel, maybe we'd have a better chance of getting some additional funding from the US DOT because of that data, knowing that you're comparing, maybe it's not,
Yeah.
golden delicious to golden delicious apples. Maybe it's
Yeah.
different apples, but you're still in the same category. Is that
Correct. Yeah, no, that actually, it's funny. I was gonna say, it is generally, if you were to submit, say, take data from this model, submit it for a discretionary grant, and you're competing with a similar community, it would, in most cases, US DOT would take it as a apples to apples comparison. Yeah. So your data on par with their data, and yeah.
okay?
But the funds that are in this plan are formula funds.
Yep.
So they're entirely based upon the census and our population.
Got it.
So
Not
we don't,
by this miles driven.
yeah, so
whatever.
we don't need to, this is allocating the funds they're not competitively distributed to the Ames MPO. They're done by formula, just like all the other MPOs in the state. But like Jason said, that when you have grant opportunities outside of the formula funds, having a good model that follows a DOT process makes you more competitive.
Thank you.
What slide would you like me on?
Advance one more at least.
One more.
Future traffic growth.
Yeah, and I think the next one's going to show you kind of where that growth is anticipated. And you can see, so basically with this, the wider the lines, the more traffic growth we're anticipating. So you do see, like, to your question, that kind of connection, say on 30, 35 to the north and the south, we are seeing pretty significant growth anticipated. Through some of our more mature kind of urban corridors, a little bit less growth. Got some infill, not a ton. And you can see a lot of that incremental of growth is kind of on the fringes there. So pretty consistent with the mapping that we've shown to this point. I'm going to keep this one pretty high level. There was kind of an interesting discussion maybe on some background on, okay, we've had a change in administrations. What's changed with federal transportation funding? What we're seeing with, and I talked to some of our national kind of funding experts on this one, but we're seeing basically the top line funding remains pretty strong, and that with the newest fiscal year budget proposal, we are seeing that most programs are funded over current year levels. And there's a whole lot of acronyms on here, and I apologize, but CRISI is railroad crossing, PIDP is ports, and then infra is more of that general kind of all multimodal corridor type grants. We're expecting to continue to see these types of grants. Safe Streets for All, like the safety action plan John's been talking about, as part of that. FTA low and no emission bus programs, those types of things are continued with new notice of funding opportunities out. There has been some impacts to US DOT staffing. We don't really know what the impact of that's going to be yet. So, but through all this process, we really, the focus in our industry has really started to pivot towards really focusing on how can we prevent life-altering crashes, those severe injury and fatal crashes. But also, we've got some high growth corridors that are, currently 2-lane rural roads. So we do see some future congestion, which also is a safety issue. But, connecting people and jobs, and then a lot of, identified barriers to pedestrian, bicycle, and transit connections. So that's kind of the story of all the public engagement, all the existing and future, analysis that we did. And so that's kind of framed how we developed kind of the draft plan that you'll see.
Yeah, so again, as Jason's talked about, the MTP, it's been developed over a long time. The process is very comprehensive. The CSAP, it focuses down to just safety and primarily just the life-altering crashes. And so what we did was we looked at approaches of not just understanding locations where there have been crash history, but also what do those crashes tell us about risk or proactivity. There's 8 key factors that we found that are contributing factors that tell us that if we address these things proactively, we can bring down the risk of fatal and serious outcomes. So distracted driving, impaired driving, and speeding, these have been well known for a long time, but we took a little bit more of a look at where crash records showed that these were occurring even for non-fatal and serious injury crashes, as they're indicators that maybe we need to review built environments or users in certain areas for what's the underlying issue. You can see here that we also have some age-based metrics. Again, these don't have anything to do with what we would necessarily change. Those people are just going to be there, but because of their presence, there maybe need to be changes. Older demographics may need signage that's larger and more legible. Younger demographics may need road patterns that are simpler to traverse, so and or stronger driver education. So these are things that we're looking at, very much like your doctor might look at what your diet and exercise routine are before they consider, when you might run into something like heart disease. The main thing that I think, to point out here is that some of these won't necessarily translate directly into projects, but because we are now better recognizing that it's not just what's going on the road itself that we should be checking for contributing factors, we're better able to understand the more holistic part of what goes into a serious crash, that it's part users, part road conditions, part speed, and then even how we care for those afterwards. So those are some of our main findings. I will say they are not as forward-looking to 2050 as the MTP findings. The methods that were available to us in this one are a lot more focused on looking at the last 5 years of crash history or so.
So I have a few questions on this. One is, can you define what impaired is for this, and also the vulnerable road users? Just explain that just in brief.
Absolutely. So impaired is typically alcohol and drugs. It's something that's on a crash form that one of our law enforcement individuals would have filled out as they. Vulnerable road users, simply put, those are folks that are not on a motorized either motorcycle or passenger car truck, so pedestrians and cyclists, but there are some others like non-motorized scooters that might fall into that same category. Generally speaking, that we use the term vulnerable road user because it had better consistency with some recent work from Iowa Department of Transportation and how FHWA is classifying those folks.
The under 25, and we'll get to this in a couple of slides, is that other members of this group who are not here tonight have asked a lot about up on the north side, 190th and Hyde in particular, where you have probably a significant number of people who are under the age of 25 potentially driving north. And so how does that factor into your analysis where because of that road was paved here recently within the last few years to get a direct pipeline up to the high schools, direct conduit into it. Can you explain how that's taken in consideration? I know that we've talked about it before. Damien and Kyle have heard this, multiple times, but it is a concern. And obviously, people aren't trying to buy trouble from tomorrow, but anticipate that maybe you got kids that are coming from the west, get to the intersection, they're not paying attention, want to go north, or you have people coming from the south. They're just trying to avoid, a tragedy from occurring there. Could you identify under 25 as being a potential a higher safety risk? So how does that factor in, or how do you think about that?
Yeah, so I do think that probably helpful here to point out that this was at the citywide crash records level. So there's a lot more depth that can probably be addressed for individual locations if you were to take this to a more deep level of study, considering human factors of younger drivers. What we're seeing again with this kind of correlation of patterns is that despite how prevalent those drivers under 25 are compared to the amount of licensed drivers under 25, that they show up more frequently in fatal and serious injury crashes. And so conditions, not necessarily just from Ames, but other places, have led to a recognition that recent years have shown that the insurance industry targets the similar group for more risky behaviors as showing up in their data. And then also that there's certainly a level of graduation during driver's licensing that contributes to younger folks. So I don't really have an answer to your specific location. I think that's something where Damien and Kyle, maybe from what they learned from the study, will be able to take it a little further in the future, but mostly just that this is a good indicator when we know that a corridor is going to serve that traffic level, that we need to be really careful with allowing high speed and gaps in trying to move from a stop, because this age group is more likely to take that aggressive maneuver through there and leads to severe outcomes.
So let me repeat what I think I heard you say, was that you look at crash data, which Damien and Kyle have mentioned many times. That's how you look at it. And there's not been a lot of crashes in certain areas. So is the study or what you're doing taking into consideration the potential for that because of a certain demographic, using that area, or is that just not really done? And so we have to just wait until something happens to really say we have to do something different. Does that make sense?
Yes. So I think that that's a good direction that, as we've started to learn this recently, having better understanding of who individual road users are on a road would help us to use this sort of proactive method. But right now, what we're mostly focused on is crash history. Again, what we're using is the more minor level of crash, like a property damage crash with younger drivers on a segment, to highlight that segment as one that may in the future have a fatal or serious injury crash and focus on that. But you certainly could extend that further using the same mindset. We just didn't have that data available here in a ready format.
So it's not, I think we're trying to be preventative. And what it sounds like is that it's really more reactive to what historically has happened versus being anticipatory and preventive, trying to avoid something from happening. Is that a good summary?
Yeah, I would say that essentially we have moved off of being reactive to locations, individual locations, for the fatalities and serious injuries. Unfortunately, that was a pattern before, where a fatality would happen, then a project would happen in that exact spot, and it was unlikely to occur there because of just statistics of rare events. But what we're doing now is we're getting smarter about recognizing that location shift, but the underlying characteristics matter, but we're not being as proactive as what you're talking about. That's true.
Very good. Thank you. I appreciate the indulgence on that one.
Oh, no problem.
I think one point that I think is important to add, and this goes to essentially how we design the built environment that people are using, is that these focus areas that Jonathan's talking about. So he gave a great example that a younger driver, for example, just has less experience driving and may have difficulty navigating really complex areas. So that's why you probably don't see a 14-year-old going through, urban interstates very often. It's just too complicated, too many things going on. So what you would do, the way I would look at it, and what Jonathan's talking about, the systemic approach would be, hey, you might have a minimum access management standard. You may have a minimum sight distance standard. You may have all these minimum engineering standards that you could build your roadway to. But you have an issue with inexperienced drivers, so widen those gaps out. Give them more time, give them more space. And those are the kind of things that when we go to rebuild streets, because we know we have this focus area, that goes into the context of the design of the road.
Mm-hmm. So like around a high school, for sake of discussion, that is taken into consideration, right?
Yes, we would probably want to use a higher standard than what our engineering, the range of engineering standards would allow us. When we can, obviously there are certain physical limitations or historical natures of certain streets that, are challenges, but we would certainly, that would be part of any kind of process to focus on it.
And my questioning is not, we have the fullest confidence in both Kyle and Damien. It's just trying to understand how you're approaching this study and not second guessing what they're doing. But it is something I know that has been talked about. And this is not new to them on the 190th, because there is some concern. I'm also trying to reflect one of our, the mayor of Gilbert has been at this, and also the supervisor that happens to be on the call also. They brought this up, and so I'll make sure that it's been touched on and understand, and we'll go from there. So thank you.
Yeah, I think the industry is always trying to evolve and get better at what we do. So.
So this is also based on our safety analysis, again, given both some reactive data to where there've been a significant number of fatalities and serious injuries, and some of this proactivity that we looked at. We selected a small percentage by lane miles of the overall roadway centerline mileage in the planning area. That comprises more than 3/4 of all fatalities and serious injuries. So safety as a lens needs to be applied to all of our projects. That takes more than just this few lane miles, but these few lane miles may be the best candidate for more significant investment near term to deal with past fatalities and serious injuries. You can see here that it's not in every case a city road. We're looking at all jurisdictions of the road here. So.
Yeah, and just briefly, and I kind of touched on this a couple of slides ago, but essentially how we got to when you get to the tail end here with the draft recommendations that we're showing, it is that combination of where are we today, where we think we're going in the future with that technical analysis, and then all the input that we got from the public, local technical staffs, planners, and engineers on staff here with all the agencies. Kind of going through that list of what potential strategies for the Metropolitan Transportation Plan might look like, and then going through a prioritization process, and we'll talk about that here in a few minutes. But, essentially then kind of leading to those recommendations.
This is a similar slide to the one I showed the last time I was here. We just advanced kind of what's been completed. Again, we based things on both safety data and stakeholder input, plus an understanding of what is the current practice within those safety practitioners. We've been working alongside the MTP to make new recommendations, and we've also been working with the MPO's technical committee on those. And then the plan will wrap up with a leadership adoption, a little bit more public and stakeholder review at the draft stage, a handover of some key recommendations to that MPO technical committee. And then based on what the grant requires, there will need to be a annual progress report that the MPO will take over once this consultant contract is done and the finalized plan's out. Did want to, again, hit on that, when you see the CSAP and you see the project list, that list of major projects alone would not necessarily lead us to a reduction of all fatalities and serious injuries by the 2050 target year. Part of that is that, again, we are focused on what action can be taken more near term and making sure that action is, aligned with what our goals are. Two other ways that we'll start to make progress near term. One of them are systemic projects. So again, those are the risk factors. Treat the risk factors early. Usually that can be done at lower cost, just like increasing your exercise level early on. Is much less cost or burden than necessarily treating cardiac syndrome. Policy strategies also are an opportunity. In many cases, how we do the work can make a project, a safety project, at very little change in overall cost, but significantly different outcomes. So, these are a few of the highlighted items for potential major projects, ones that fit really well with the current MTP and past MTPs, but have been updated for this latest round of analysis and engagement. Again, we talked about how a lot of the severity is conflict with crossing traffic. So treatments like roundabouts and or disallowing certain types of minor street lefts so that people can really make that turn at a safer location. Those are low conflict. Changing how we allow people to access a major road so that they're doing it at ways that they can see better and that maybe they're not competing with such high speeds. That's a major improvement. And then also things that have been discussed in the walk bike road plan, separations of pedestrian cyclists to their own space really helps because of the difference in speed and potential force on a collision between a vehicle and pedestrian or cyclist. This is the first of a number of maps on projects, but this one is most geared towards the CSAP. You can see here that we've taken that network that we identified before. Some segments have come off because there's not an obvious project there, but in other cases, we've started to make a recommendation of, will we treat things by modifying access? Will we look to treat by changing how the lanes and or sidewalks that are there today, what their dimensions are to kind of give them back to the appropriate use. And then yet other cases, are we merely just needing to add additional features, like maybe more features to how the intersection is designed or more side path type features. There's a couple of places where I called out some specific safety needs, railroad safety crossing in some cases. And then in certain cases, we've called out roundabouts. I do think, one of the goals, again, of the safety action plan being funded, is to allow communities to see these proven safety countermeasures. They're proven because they have scientific evidence in many studies showing their efficiency, and then finding locations where these communities can test these out and learn that whether or not this makes sense to continue to use more broadly in the community. And that's sort of the approach we adopted here. We didn't put every treatment in every location. We were much more select than that.
What is a systemic traffic signal?
It's a really good question. So we're talking there about how there is an existing traffic signal. There's not a reason to remove the traffic signal. That's inappropriate, but there might be changes that could happen within the existing signal. We might be able to change how the yellow time is so that we're doing more appropriate for what the speeds are there today, or more red time to keep people from being T-boned. We could also be looking at changes that make it more conspicuous or get pedestrians crossing earlier than we give warning to vehicles.
Thank you.
Yep.
So it's interesting that on Saturday at an event, someone came up and can you zoom in on that at all? Up on Ontario and where state?
I don't think I can zoom while it's in presentation. Not that I know.
Okay, all right. So
Sorry.
you have an intersection up there on 13th, turns into Ontario, and where it's actually where Highland intersects.
Right.
They said that they have witnessed personally bikers that are coming up the hill because it's a pretty steep grade. They're not really paying attention to traffic, and it's almost a blind corner there for people turning, right. She said, so what would you suggest? Well, just eliminate right-hand turn. I said, well, that's probably not going to happen. So is that something that you have already identified because of the biking, and because it's identified as an intersection reconfiguration? Is that how you're arriving at some of these? And it's the timing was perfect that she mentioned a couple of days ago, and I remembered it, believe it or not. So
well, and there's a construction on Highland right now. So would that be a project that we would do sooner rather than later?
Yeah, again, in a lot of cases, what we looked at were some of those treatments with really high effectiveness. If the roadway section just to the east of there is probably got too many lanes, encouraging faster speeds, knowing that we're about to go into more residential areas. So, that project looking to potentially take some lanes away, that puts us in a spot where the intersection needs to change. We weren't able to determine feasibility of certain, whether you would change how the left turns operated, or whether you would adjust, what the right turns are there, or if maybe roundabout fits. But generally speaking, we felt like by taking those lanes away, you would need to do something in order to kind of better allow multimodal traffic to make that turn off there. And we hadn't yet identified what, but you'll see later there's a list of projects and studies that would help to get to some of those recommendations.
So as we move into this phase, I don't think we've talked about yet tonight the number of federal dollars that we're looking at. And I assume that DOGE will also impact these federal dollars. So let's just say, for the sake of discussion, that the dollars are constant. Let's just, for the sake of discussion, how many dollars are we talking about?
That is, again, kind of a difficult question. So what the MTP will cover are the dollars that you will get. The program, the Safe Streets and Roads for All program, the round that's out right now, it was $1 billion this year after the DOGE came through. And generally, the way that that's been split up, their anticipated award level was $600 million to construction projects. Now, again, for as many as there are throughout the country, that's not as large as some other federal grants that are out there. So it's going to be a highly competitive environment.
Well, let me rephrase the question then. How many dollars did we get last year if we just use that as a benchmark?
So
let me clarify, I guess, the difference between the CSAP and the MTP as far as what kind of projects are being shown. So for the CSAP, kind of like John was saying, this is more geared towards the SS4A program as far as showing the list of high impact projects that can reduce serious injury and fatality crashes. That could be good candidates to apply for implementation funding from the SS4A program, which is a competitive or discretionary grant directly from USDOT. And so obviously that's a nationwide competitive grant. So it would be hard to pinpoint exactly how much we could expect to potentially be awarded for that. But we know how much dollars are available. But again, that's nationwide. But for the MTP, the plan that you'll see in a little while here, the projects in that are fiscally constrained based off of the anticipated formula federal funding that our MPO is expected to be allocated. So currently our MPO gets around $2 million a year in STBG funds, which is like the Surface Transportation Block Grant, I think is what that stands for. So those are funds that the MPO is distributed through Iowa DOT to award to regional projects. So they're federally sourced, but our MPO has the authority to accept applications and award funds. So again, that's around $2 million a year. I believe our plan forecasts was a 3 or 4% annual
budget increases of about 2%, and then cost increases of about 4%.
Yeah, so about 2% annual increase in funding after the next 4 years. So I believe the next 4 years it's flat. And then after that, it's around 2% annual growth projections for those federal dollars being projected through 2050. And then those are kind of bucketed into short-term, mid-term, and long-term as far as how the projects are shown. And I think that'll make more sense when we get to that project map. And we also have tables, I think, in the packet that we can pull up to that would also maybe clear that up a little bit. And then we also have the TAP program, which is more for multimodal projects or trail projects, bike lanes, trails, that kind of thing. And that is around $200,000 a year is how much we're currently targeted. And then we also have the carbon reduction program, which is more for traffic signal type projects or projects that can reduce emissions. With that program, it is a formula funding program, but the expectation is that we don't anticipate that program coming back with the next infrastructure bill, given the current administration and the current look of what we're expecting, I guess, moving forward. So with that program, we didn't anticipate any future funding for that. And that, I think currently our MPO is mostly planning to use that for the traffic adaptive network that the city's been building out and the traffic fiber network. But so around $2 million a year for the STBG and then around $200,000 for TAP. It's kind of the short answer, I guess, to what funding revenue is there.
Okay.
So you'll see with the MTP, the long range plan, that we start with this huge list of projects, and then we really have to narrow that down based off of that limited funding that the MPO is targeted. However, I think there's still a lot of value in the prioritization process that comes with this plan, because obviously some of those projects could be funded through other ways, whether it's a national competitive grant like SS4A, or with local means or anything like that.
And that's exactly where I was going. So $2 million is not a big prize for us to be pursuing. And so we'll certainly use the dollars and appreciate the dollars and send a thank you note. My question then, Damien, for you, imagine in a world where we weren't having this conversation and you were left to advise the city about the prioritization of our transportation system. Is there a delta between what this system drives and the system that you would drive?
Well, it's hard to say because it's been, I don't know that we've ever done, especially since I have started here, we've had the MPO and we've had the MPO's modeling process. So I think what you're talking about is like, how would you analyze your system from like an asset management, from a safety prioritization, and from a dealing with congestion standpoint, like kind of all the metrics that a city would look at, like what are the areas to improve? How would I score things? And this process that's why I meant earlier when I was talking about the national best practice. Like these are engineering and planning standards. They're just prescriptive through the DOT process. So there isn't another set of metrics that we would use. This is a civil engineering, this is a transportation planning metric standard that is required by the DOT, but there isn't another system that we would leverage. So what I would say, you're right to say that we have limited federal dollars, but this plan takes our local funding. And so we met with our finance department, and we include road use tax, our bonding levels, our local option sales tax, like all the typical funding sources that is used locally to match these federal dollars and then some, and try to put together a plan. So I would say that we would use the best tools that are available. And right now, these, like this model, the crash data that we get through the state DOT, all those things would, like, if the MPO wasn't here, I would be using these. We would just be paying for them locally rather than leveraging through DOT. It would be doing essentially the same process without DOT oversight.
And
so
that's super helpful. So if we didn't have an MPO, you'd be recommending the same process of evaluation, because the $2 million in the big scheme of things would not be worth pursuing ourselves. And what I was trying to tease out, and I'm sort of intrigued with this, that there is this uniform national standard, because I guess I would assume that communities would have different values. They say you could have a community that would really more value bike lanes and bike infrastructure more than another. You could have a city that had older infrastructure, that it had different needs just because of the age of its roads. So the starting point that we would have a uniform system that applies regardless of the size of the city, regardless of the demographics, is intriguing to me, because I think that community values has to play a role in this. But for the sake of our discussion tonight, I think it's really valuable what you just said. And so I'm going to take what you said at face value, that we're going to presume that this outcome that they're recommending would be the same if we didn't have the MPO.
Yeah, and don't get me wrong, the DOT, the federal government doesn't, the categories that you listed out, things like how much do I care about safety? How much do I care about walking and biking? They don't, for, to use kind of common, they don't get in our business about that. They want to make sure that we're looking at these categories. So my comment about the framework is the categories, like all the different aspects and attributes about a transportation system, like how it works, how it looks, how it feels, those kind of things. That's the framework that I'm talking about. And all the public meetings and asking the public about, like, how do you care about these things? How would you put them first, second, third, and whatnot? Like, that is how it becomes a local plan and becomes our local flavor. So if the MPO wasn't there, I actually, we used to have spiral bound, I think literally hand typed plans that the city of Ames, we had a master street plan before we were in MPO that I think was hand typed that I saw. We had a bike ped master plan that I'm pretty sure was, I don't know on what age computer that was done before we were in MPO. So these efforts aren't new to us, even though we have an MPO.
Great, thank you. This has been very helpful.
And maybe one thing I would add about this map that we were talking about, and I think is important to point out, is that this plan doesn't do engineering. So you might see projects and they will have names, kind of categorical names like an intersection improvement, a roundabout improvement. And that is because the way the attribute of the road, the characterizations of the problems that are at that location, it puts it in a bucket or in a category where the best thing you should do is go look at intersection reconfiguration. But that means start the design process, start a public meeting process, figure out and root out all the issues. This plan doesn't get that level. It's looking at those kind of high level metrics. So I think every time you look at a project that we're going to go through a few, keep in mind that these are on that network attribute level. They don't get down into actual design and what these things. So kind of the example we're looking at, we have a lot of local knowledge about Highland and 13th and Ontario. Like we're very intimately knowledge about where the conflict points, where the lane configurations end up. But those attributes make it show up in this map, but the solution has to come later.
Okay. Yep, thank you for all that.
So I'm seeing on this map a number of places that are obviously institutional roads. And I'm wondering if you could briefly tell us what the relationship is between those kinds of projects, which are clearly on Iowa State property, and the other sorts of projects that are included in the CSAP.
So one of the things that this is a good question to bring this up is that because of that comprehensive word in there, we really needed to focus on all of the roads, no matter ownership. But one of the opportunities of the USDOT Safe Streets and Roads for All program is that it takes the largest transportation organizations, the state DOT, and makes them ineligible to go for funds. But it actually increases the eligibility for an institution like Iowa State to be able to actually, if they own roads and they were to have a road that was identified, they could receive federal match should they win a competitive grant. So we spoke with Iowa State and made sure that likelihood of the strategy being a fit was appropriate. There were no commitments on either side right now as to when a project might be programmed. And as you'll see in the MTB, it gets back to mostly roads that are owned by, cities and counties. And so, but generally speaking, that is one of the goals of the CSAP, is to find roads that have safety issues regardless of ownership, in case one of those roads could benefit from having a federal to local match that help make a project happen.
Thank you.
Yep.
Jonathan, anything on this slide else you would like to say?
No, I think you can move on.
Okay.
All right. So as we build towards kind of that recommended fiscally constrained metropolitan transportation plan list, one of the things we really need to take into account is, okay, we've got projects in capital plans already. We want to make sure that we're taking that into account, because a lot of times, an issue will arise and it'll be related to a project that we've already got kind of lined up for funding in the next 5 years. So this is just kind of documenting, we're taking these into account. We're assuming they're already in place. If we think this is what's happening over the next 5 years, this plan is really a 2030 through 2050 plan. So as we go to the next slides, that's where we start getting into the types of alternatives we're considering beyond that capital plan. And so we're looking at what we call management type projects. These are John talked about access changes and medians and improved pedestrian crossings. It's kind of taking what we have out in a corridor already, and we're trying to make it safer or operate a little bit better by making kind of these incremental changes to it. Turn lanes, we got, it could be a center turn lane or intersections where traffic's starting to pick up. It's really important to make sure we safely separate that traffic so they can make those turns. Lane reconfiguration, this is essentially, John talked about this again, a lot of times it's taking one of those 4-lane roads that we have today where we don't have that center turn lane and going to like a 3-lane section where it makes sense, where we've got high level of turns and a certain traffic volume where it would be safer and an efficient way to operate. Intersection control, signalization, restricting left turns. Again, some of this goes back to some of those CSAP. We also do have, potential new interchanges, new roads, widening of existing roads in a few places, and roundabouts. I think those are pretty self-explanatory. And then also, so we had the great, fortune of working off of the bicycle and pedestrian plan that had been done, that walk, bike, roll project. And we took that entire list and really started to brought in that whole list. But on the next slide, you'll see how we kind of focused it down. We've got a later one. We basically focused it down based on, what projects would be eligible for federal funding. And again, thinking about those vulnerable road users, that term John used, how do we focus on providing those safe and important connections? So we kind of interface the safety action plan with the MTP there and really kind of prioritize those projects that would support that high priority network. And then real quick on the next one, we talk about the prioritization process. And basically this is a representation, Damien talked about performance measures and that process. But it's essentially how well projects line up to our goals and objectives. And you'll see some here that score pretty high. They don't necessarily represent, when we're going to need it. They might be projects that we'd need later and closer to 2050, and doesn't necessarily, recognize how soon it would be before they'd be feasible in terms of project development. So if we go to the next slide, this is what I thought was next. This is the prioritized walk, bike, and roll projects. So again, we looked at what would be eligible for that MPO funding and which ones would support those kind of high priority corridors, and kind of focused it down and showed those high and medium priority projects that came out of walk, bike, and roll. If we go to the next one, this is that kind of range of all the different alternatives we would consider that came out of this process for the Metropolitan Transportation Plan. We've got different intersection projects. We've got different street projects, segment projects, and kind of went through that process of, okay, how do they score against all these different, goals and objectives that we've got? Again, I reinforce this is not necessarily indicative of how big of a need it is, because we could have something on here that really checked all the boxes, let's say for safety. That's about all it checked. And it could be one of the biggest needs in the community, but there, we've got all these different areas, we score them. And so sometimes, we've got probably some medium projects on here that might be some of the most important ones to do right away. But this is a good metric for just indicating, how many of those different gold boxes are we checking. And then as we went through kind of that process, that modeling process, and understanding where that future growth was, identified a lot of projects that were identified as likely needs, but also were likely going to be triggered by adjacent development. And so these were projects that we kind of made that list that were assumed to coincide with adjacent development and likely had private funding associated with them. And then we have arrived at the draft set of the recommended streets plan. And so you can see we've put them into these buckets. Kyle kind of touched on this. We've got short term. So this is essentially, we talked about how we've got projects that are committed between now and 2029 in current capital programs. So these would be in the short term, midterm, and long term between 2030 and 2050. And so in packets, you saw we had tables. We tried to line up the federal funding and the ability to have a local match. And again, Kyle mentioned like those $2 million increments of the surface transportation block grant funding, that STBG lined up. A lot of these projects are STBG type projects, lined up the funding as they came available with those highest term needs and where we thought some of the most short-term projects might be. And then we also do have a couple of projects that could potentially be state projects on here. We're showing the US 30 widening out to University, reconfiguration of South Duff, and then a potential new interchange down south on I-35. And then bicycle and pedestrian plan. Again, we have a small pot of money here. Kyle talked about the TAP funding, the Transportation Alternatives Program funding. And almost all of these are side path or shared use path type projects. We do have one on South 16th Street that is a widening of an existing path. But again, these were lined up with the walk, bike, roll plan, were eligible for MPO funding, and kind of check the boxes on being consistent with that high priority network from the safety action plan. And then I think you probably saw that through this process identified a wide range of potential future studies. And this kind of overlaps a lot with those corridors that you showed in the fiscal constraint plan, where a little extra work might need to be done. We've got kind of an interjurisdictional one on S2 there, with some of that being an Iowa State road as well. But then we've got that growth area to the south and a potential interchange, and some of those studies that we anticipate probably might be needed not only in the next 5 years, but also well into the future. And so I know there might be a few more specific questions maybe on some of the projects, but next steps, we will be coming back to you July 29th with a draft document for your review and approval. In the meantime, we're going through agency partner reviews. There will be an online comment period for the public, and then final adoption September 23rd. I don't know, Kyle, was there anything you wanted to add to this discussion? Or
No, I think, yeah, the next steps is good. I think tonight, what we're really wanting to hear is feedback on those projects from the committee, as far as what's being shown in that fiscally constrained plan for the MTP, as well as that list of projects for the CSAP. So I think we want to really make sure any questions are being asked for those projects, or any feedback is being given on those. And we can obviously pull the slides back up for those maps. And we also have tables. There's a separate packet that was sent out as the second attachment on the memo, but we also have that there, which kind of the tables show like the more specifics of each of these projects, because obviously on these maps it's just kind of an ID and where it is, but the table kind of shows what the planning level cost estimate of that project is, what the project even entails, like is it a roundabout, is it a intersection modification, that kind of thing. So yeah, any type of questions like that, any feedback is kind of what we're looking for.
And we could go to that map too, if the streets or the bicycle pedestrian. Sorry.
Good. I'm a little confused. I mean, my understanding was you've gone through a very in-depth analysis using different metrics and using models and following federal guidelines and standards, et cetera, et cetera. So am I hearing you say, if the committee says, we don't want to do that, we want to do something else, that's okay? I mean, it just seemed like, so we're basically making a decision that's contradictory to what your recommendations are based on modeling and for extremely intelligent experts in the safety and transportation world. So, and then also you have a justification for it. But if we say, well, I want my road paved, right away, there's no justification for it. So help us understand what would be a justification or rationale for overruling what all your expert work is doing and modeling. Why would we go ahead and do that? Because I just heard Kyle say, we want to hear your feedback, and do you agree with these projects?
Well, I think an important thing to keep in mind, and kind of what we were talking a little bit earlier about the DOT and how they're involved in this process. Mm-hmm. So the requirements of the plan is a process. So like it is a prescriptive process. And so those performance measures, the performance-based planning requirement of this plan, and the multiple sieves process of getting to what you see here follows those requirements. And so really the way we try to prioritize things, the way we essentially say, here's the need, it's based on those. If they are just wildly not in line with, like you all have your different constituent groups, you hear from people. If what we're talking about just wild doesn't even make sense, which we're hoping it does, and I don't know that it ever hasn't, then I would think there's a reason to discuss and like drill in deeper about, well, why is this project first? And then we can talk about, well, it checks all these boxes. It has the highest safety need. It sees the most congestion. It's the most underbuilt or in the worst condition. And, you know, and I would say that those hopefully would satisfy those concerns. So really that's what Kyle is looking at is saying like, have we provided you with enough information so that you understand how the metrics are being applied, how the projects are being prioritized, and why we get down to a relatively small amount of projects that are federal aid eligible. And again, that doesn't mean other projects that are entirely locally funded or private public partnerships that are happening. All those things are happening in part of the system. But this is really like where you're spending the federal aid dollars so that each jurisdiction, and that's the other piece of it too, is that these projects then would come forward with a sponsor.
Yeah.
So, and obviously a lot of them are within the city of Ames. So the city of Ames is typically an applicant on a lot of these things. So that's, I would say that if under the scenario that you were describing about we just throw all this away and we pick our own projects ad hoc, then I would say the DOT would say, well, you didn't follow our process. So, and thankfully, I mean, as we've tried to build trust on like all these technical processes, we just want to make sure this is really just a check-in to make sure that we're on the right page and you understand what this plan is and how it got to this point.
And it's a required check-in.
Certainly, yes, yeah.
We have to be here.
So, a couple of questions. One is you're showing on the recommended plan bike pedestrian along Southeast 16th, project B 134. Didn't we just put in new paths there on the south side and on the north side, and now we're doing additional work on there?
We're showing that one.
I know I had a constituent that complained that they had to put, a sidewalk on the south side of South 16th right across, from on the east side of Grand. And that'd be a pretty bitter pill to swallow to go back there and say, I'm sorry, we got to widen this, So I'm just curious, can you explain a lot of that's all new work and been redone with some of the overhead power lines and some of the development out there?
Well, and there are, so that what Kyle was saying, so that's listed as a widening of the trail. So like vehicle growth, we expect growth in bike and pedestrian activity.
Mhm.
And so when you get a standard, so a lot of trails that we've had in the past were built at 8 foot. I think the most kind of germane discussion around this is what you hear up at Ada Hayden about the activity and the need to widen that trail. And kind of like, well, we've hit that trigger point where it makes sense to widen something because we have a lot of users. So what you're seeing here is a project that's moving forward in time. So it's trying to match up with what we expect growth to be and where the best investment to meet that growth is going to happen. So that's why today, if you look at it in today's time frame, it kind of doesn't make as much sense. But if you think about it in a future, like a fourth dimensionally, as biking, because the South 16th Street widening will have trails on both sides. You'll have a connection to the trail on University. You'll have connections to trails on Duff. You have a trail down South Grand. You have all these connections that kind of feed into that area.
And right now, it's not all equal. Like the bike path that passes in front of one property on South 16th might look quite a lot different than the rest of them.
And this is long term, so you're talking about what's your time frame for long term?
It
That
was,
was
sorry.
Oh, Was that a long-term one? Oh, I see.
Yeah.
that.
43, 2020, sorry, 2043 to 2050.
Yeah.
So it's the very end of the plan. Yep.
Got it.
What is the short-term bike one? It just seems, now that one seems kind of up in the middle of nowhere.
The B114.
Well, as you recall, that is the Skunk River Trail.
Oh.
So there was a Skunk River Trail alignment that went behind like followed the river and went behind houses, but there is ag property so that's by Innes Grove Park. So what that is to bring North River Valley Park, where it ends today, would come up by Innes Grove, go through Innes Grove, and then get on to Duff Avenue.
I see.
Because of where we would cross, we can't bring a trail through because the property owner and it's ag property, so we can't bring a trail through that area. So that is to complete the connection by bringing it over to Grand and then utilize the trail that goes
I see.
north of there.
Okay. Thank you.
So there's been some discussion also. You can go back one slide. That's it. Yeah. At GW Carver and Cameron School Road, which is maybe the intersection south of N48 project.
Yep, right here.
Is there any thoughts on that, Damien or Kyle, in terms of, long-term? I mean, that could potentially become, a lot of traffic starting to occur there. And then also would be tying in potentially long-term with an extension of Stang Road coming up in that area.
Well, there is a development agreement locally
Okay.
that
So this
addresses
is federal type stuff then.
So maybe what I should just speak to tonight is the MPO's perspective, which is this traffic, given the traffic conditions and the traffic growth, the speed, where it is located, the intersection of Cameron School Road and GW Carver, our preference, the MPO's preference and the metrics that are applied, it should be a roundabout intersection. So if that project came before the MPO asking for federal dollars, and we had them, the preference would be towards a roundabout.
And when we say federal dollars, this is exclusive of us trying, or the city or whatever, trying to get additional grants. This is primarily the uniform or consistent funding stream that's coming through. That's what the baseline is. Is that correct?
Yeah, this is focused on those baseline funding sources that Kyle talked about, the SDBG funds and the TAP funds.
Is there any thought ever given to, this would fit in well to apply for some grants that would really help enhance it? Or would you go back to this drawing and pick some of I'm making this up, there's N79. We'll go for a grant for that because we think it needs to happen more quickly.
Oh, no, absolutely. No, that doesn't negate any of that activity. So like most funding plans, this is intended to be conservative, which means it's guaranteed funded sources. So if we have grants of opportunity or things come up that could accelerate any piece of the plan, that's why you see so the projects never go away in a long range plan. Like the fiscally constrained plan, those are the ones we expect money to be spent on, but everything else becomes illustrative, which essentially the better way of thinking about it is a project of opportunity. It still has benefit to the system if you find another way to fund it. So certainly, if there was more grants or other funding sources, those projects then become a reality, and perhaps maybe don't even need to be programmed through the MPO.
Well, and again, come back to the $2 million carrot that we're chasing. Help us understand, can you give us an example of what a recent construction project cost for roads, just to give us a sense of what $2 million buys us? Because these pictures up here are not going to be purchased for $2 million, right? They'll buy a little piece. Can you give us just a sense of what maybe the Lincoln Way, the West Lincoln Way project cost this last summer? Something like that.
That was pretty much exactly our annual allocation, around that $2 million.
Okay.
Reconstruction.
So that's a really helpful data point as we think about prioritizing. Do we spread this out over lots of little projects, or do we take one project and put all of our chips in that? So
my last question is, as you've looked at this, the two of you with your local knowledge and historical, background, and Justin, you've been out on the streets a lot also from a standpoint of, as out with the fleet. Are there things that pop out to you that you're surprised that aren't showing up, or is this pretty much reflect what you see as really being the needs in our community?
No, I think in Kyle had talked about this too, and so like the list of studies. So, and I understand like because this is the current plan, so it doesn't necessarily go through all the studies. So we've had like a Grand Avenue corridor plan, we had a South Duff interchange plan. We're currently in the process of doing a corridor study on Duff from the railroad tracks north to the hospital. So we've had all these corridor study plans and another detailed looks into what are the best improvements, where are the areas we need to work on. So from a historical process of studying things and figuring out what are the needs, I think this is very much in line with what we would want to see. And especially, again, I feel like we're kind of hammering this home, but to program those limited dollars in the best way that we can. Yeah. And that's where a lot of things about federal aid, as you know, gets complicated if you don't have right of way, if you don't have other things. So we try to consolidate projects into areas that don't require complicated federal processes when we go to do project lettings.
Well, for me, that's very helpful to hear you say that you have confidence this is reflecting what you think the needs are. That's an important factor that at least would affect my a decision or vote. Any other questions?
Yeah, I have one, Mayor.
Please go ahead.
I'm somewhat mystified by the Mortensen Road segment, Mortensen Parkway, with proposed roundabouts and intersection reconfiguration, all based on whatever study might be done next. And I look at that and I live near there. And I know that the intersection with University Boulevard is problematic. There have been a lot of accidents there. But it feels like we're giving this segment a lot of attention, and I'm not really sure why, especially since it connects to some of the worst institutional road in the city that we continuously get complaints about. So can you explain the logic of the, I guess what I would consider like a hyper focus on that Mortensen Parkway segment with the roundabouts, etc.?
Certainly. So like Jason and Jonathan had talked about earlier, we've applied those kind of systematic metrics to all these streets, and the segments that popped up, this was one of them. And so there's really bad sight distance. There's safety issues around it. You have a multi-lane road that from a traffic volume standpoint, doesn't necessarily need to be a 4-lane road now or into the future when you project the model and traffic on it. But we're not starting with nothing. And so as staff, we realize that what you're showing here, if we would come forward with some project, it's a big ticket, it's a big dollar amount, and it would be a significant change. So that's what that study is to look at, is to look at if you could rebuild Mortensen Parkway today, how would you do it? That's what this is. We would probably want a 2-lane road with roundabouts to deal with the sight distance, to deal with the curvilinear nature, maybe improve bike and pedestrian. Right now, a lot of the trails are right on the back of curb. Maybe there's something we could do there, on and on and on. But we know that we have existing infrastructure that's in pretty good condition. So other than the geometrics of the street, there's a lot of other considerations about when to actually spend money. So that's why you see that as a study. And the midterm is related to when we think that you're going to kind of hit that threshold of need.
So how does you're probably acutely aware, how does football traffic and how does basketball traffic and I think everyone who lives here would agree, Beach Avenue, where it intersects with Mortensen, is basically almost a invitation to getting T-boned one way or the other, essentially. And then I think I had been on that road from time to time, or trying to go from Mortensen onto one of the roads going up there north, and people just do not slow down on that road, and they're coming around trying to come on two wheels almost, and turns around some of those curves. It must be a fun road to drive on. So how does that factor in terms of the occasional big dumping of vehicles onto this particular area?
No, and that's exactly where it's a great point, and kind of where I would go next with it is that's the purpose of the study. Because something that maybe isn't clear looking at these maps is that the regional transportation model is modeling a average normal day. It is not looking at special events. It's not looking at every scenario that your network could possibly go through. You probably saw that we had a TISMO plan that we're working on, like that traffic systems management operations plan. I think I got that acronym. It's close. Sounds right, doesn't it? That might be a plan where you go through all the different operational scenarios. So the study, no, we recognize that. And I think there's other segments. So 13th Street up by Stang intersection. That's another great one where perhaps move-in or other heavy traffic events around that are university driven might need 4 lanes. But from a safety standpoint, from the metrics we would look at, from an average day, you probably don't need 4 lanes on that road. But we don't know. And we don't know what other problems we might be causing by reducing the lanes. And that's what I think that study is trying to do, is really dive deep into the scenarios to make sure that the investment makes sense. But again, we don't do the engineering here. This is a planning level document.
All right. Any closing questions? Go ahead.
Yeah, one other question, and this is a kind of general follow-up. Generally speaking, is it safer to have bike paths crossing roundabouts than crossing intersections? Because I know we've got the question of widening the bike paths on Mortensen and or adding roundabouts, and I assume the study will go into all of this, but what's the relationship between bicycle safety, wider paths, and roundabout crossing?
Well, I would say, generally speaking, the more visual and time space separation you can give a bicyclist from a car, the better it is. So I think when we look at the design, and it relates to the traffic volume. So you'll probably notice a lot of the roundabouts that are in this plan and proposed as a proactive safety treatment they're not on the major principal arterial streets. They're on essentially the fringe streets, the boundaries between the urban environment and the rural area, mainly to get people to come down to an urban speed, but they're at traffic volume levels where those conflicts can be easily managed. And they can be managed at median approaches to what a typical roundabout looks like. A good example of where we do have difficulties, so if you look at the Airport Road in University roundabout, because of traffic volume reasons, that has a slip lane, that westbound and northbound movement. When you have higher volume roundabouts, they have these traffic features that are hard. Those are challenges for bikes and pedestrians. So you're not seeing that where we're proposing them and looking at them. Those bike and vehicle interactions are very well managed at the approaches because of the volumes, because of the speeds, and so forth.
All right.
Thank you.
Are you looking for a motion, or are you more or less just asking for any other objections?
No, this is just a workshop tonight, so we're not here to make any decisions. We're here to discuss and make sure that the information is that you all know and have the chance to discuss and ask these questions. So the future meetings is where we'll bring things back for actual vote.
Okay. All right. If there's no further questions, any policy committee comments?
I love these meetings because they help me to appreciate the work of our staff. So we are, smaller communities, they don't have staff to do this. So we appreciate the work of our staff, and thanks for coming and your valuable input, but thanks for guiding us through this.
All right, Gloria or Linda, any comments?
No comments from me, and I think Linda is off.
Okay, all right. With that, entertain motion to adjourn.
Move we adjourn.
Second, is there a second? Second. Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All right,
Aye.
we are adjourned. All right, we call the special meeting of the Ames City Council for June 17th to order. We have one item, presentation for future electric generation. Don?
Thank you, Mayor. With me tonight is our new Energy Services Coordinator, Lane Farber. He's been here 2 days now. And so if anything, you have any questions tonight on the presentation, I'm going to hand those over to Lane.
And this will be on video, Lane, forever.
Say again?
This will be on video forever if you drop the ball on those questions. So
All right.
no pressure.
You may want to at least grab it. If you are going to speak, you may want to have the mic close to you. All right. Thank you again, Mayor and City Council. So let me set the stage here. Back in December of last year, we met with City Council, talked about a bunch of studies that were going on, and we were prepping you for our capital improvement plan. We since have gone through the capital improvement plan. We thought it would be good after going to URAB, come back to you and basically talk about the 3 studies we did. Some of the slides in here are redundant for what we went through in December, and I'll gloss over those so we can focus on the meat of it. As an engineer, there are some great graphs in here and some great information that I do want to cover with you. All right, so basically we're going to talk again about our utility priorities and the guidelines. We're going to tell you currently what our current status is of the generation that we have, and then talk about our projected needs 10 years and even beyond the next 10 years. One of the studies we talked about was the health assessment of our current generation. Specifically, that's Unit 7 and Unit 8. Those are the 2 units at the end of Main Street that burn refuse-derived fuel and natural gas. We're going to talk about some of the new generation technologies. We had a consultant talk about different ways of serving our customers in the future. We're going to talk about that. Then we apply them specifically to Ames, what our loads look like, what our customer usage is, and things like that. That's the 3rd study. And then wrap that up with basically where we're seeing on a high level where the utility is going, and we'll share some information on that. Again, this slide has been done before, back in December. Our utility priorities are based on 3 core principles, if you will. Affordability, we want to keep our rates similar to our neighboring utilities, lower if we can do that, especially lower than the mayor's electric utility. Sustainability is also very important to us with the climate action plan. We want to continue to look at green resources. We'll talk a little bit about current administration and how that may or may not impact things. The key thing is they're heavily dependent upon Mother Nature. If the wind doesn't blow, if the sun doesn't shine, we need other generation to serve our loads. And then the 3rd one is reliability. Let me talk just briefly on that. Reliability kind of comes in 2 ways. One is physically the wires to move electricity in and out of the city. We have 3 major transmission lines, one that connects down to Ankeny, one that connects over to Boone, and one that connects down to, it's called John Deere Substation, but it's basically down Highway 69. The other portion of that is capacity, and we're part of the MISO planning organization, and we need to either have or have contracts for enough physical generating capacity to meet our peak load plus a reserve margin, 110% reserve margin. To put that into perspective, so as you look at how we're operating generation today, one of our units is typically on burning refuse-derived fuel. And you say, well, when we're done burning refuse-derived fuel, we don't really need those units. They're not going to be run as much and things like that. Case in point, right now, capacity in the MISO market. So in other words, just to meet that reliability obligation, if we did not have Unit 8, for the 3 summer months, it would cost us $4 million in capacity replacement. Doesn't have to generate 1 kilowatt. We need that capacity there. And that's for 1 season. Now it happens to become cheaper in the fall, more expensive in the winter again, and cheaper in the spring. But that's a huge component in having the capability or having that capacity generation sitting there. Energy is another separate component to that, but from a reliability standpoint, MISO requires that. I'll go it this way here. Jeez. If it'll let me. All right, I'll try that. Okay. Again, I won't spend a lot of time on these, but from those from those reliability, affordability, and sustainability, we then talked about what does that mean for us? We want to be able to serve the city's peak with generating units that we can turn on and turn off. It is hard to plan to meet our energy needs with wind and solar today because you can't turn them on and off. You need to have batteries or things like that. Under normal conditions, we want to be able to, so if we lose transmission, derecho is an excellent example. We want to have not single redundancy, but double redundancy to meet our reliability. The third one, we definitely want to keep our customers cost competitive. It doesn't mean anything if our rates double. If we have sustainable and reliable service, but our rates are double, it does not help our customers. We want to limit the overproducing or selling of energy only from green sources. And this is going to become apparent in a future slide where we show our wind today versus our load. But if you can imagine, there is an overabundance of wind today in this market. So you may say, well, if our load is 100 megawatts and we have 200 megawatts of wind, we'll sell that 100 megawatts into the market and we'll make lots of money and things will be great. When in actuality, there's so much wind that if we're overproducing in a high wind market, you actually have to pay to get rid of it. So it's actually cost prohibitive in some cases. So in our scenario, we wanted to make sure that we're building to meet our needs, not building for speculation or anything like that. This changes a little bit if you start thinking about batteries and what you can do, but I won't go there yet. And then the last thing is basically we do want to be a sustainable community. So we want to serve as much of the city's electric load with green energy without compromising the other full bullets. Where are we at today? Okay, currently we have about 28,000 customers. This is based on meters. We have a peak demand, which we hit in 2023 of 138 megawatts. The previous peak to that was set way back in 2012. With council support, we've done a lot in load reduction, rebates, energy efficiency, and things like that. So it took us 11 years to hit a new peak, which saves us and our customers a lot of money. But we had 138 in 2023. We had 134 and change in 2024. Our overall energy sales, so this is like a rolling 12 months, we sold 630,000 megawatt hours. That was our peak 2 years ago. We're at about 617,000 right now. The weather is not as hot as it could be, and so we're selling a little less energy. We have basically 4 units of significance. Unit 7 was put in 1967. Now, I know most of you up on the dais are not that old. Some of you might be, but power plant built in 1967 is pretty close to 60 years old, 58 we'll say. And we'll talk a little bit about that. We put in gas turbine number 1 in 1972. Unit 8 was put in 1982, and our last gas turbine was put in 2005. We've got currently some green energy resources under contract. We have a 36 megawatt wind contract that expires in 2029. We'll talk a little about that. And 2 megawatts of solar that we put in over by the airport in 2020. By 2035, we're estimating, and again, there's some science to this, but this can get all blown out of the water, and I'll talk about that in a second. We anticipate that we'll have about 30,000 customers within our footprint. Peak demand will grow to about 160 megawatts, and this is kind of based on what we call beneficial electrification and the conversion off of fossil fuel resources for heating and cooling and converting to electricity. We believe our energy sales will be approaching 700,000, and we're anticipating that we're no longer burning refuse-derived fuel in 2027. This is a likely scenario. Interestingly enough, we've been approached by a couple of data miners that they would love to hook up 30 megawatts onto our system tomorrow and they would probably require about 200,000 megawatt hours of energy. So if something like that were eventually brought into the city, these numbers change a lot.
So stay on that for us, Don. And I've been curious about that. You and I talked a couple of weeks ago. There is a town somewhere in north central Iowa that has done exactly that. Do you remember the name of that town?
I can think of a couple off the top of my head. Cedar Falls has Bitcoin mining within its community. I want to say 40 megawatts. I'm looking at him because he actually worked there for a year, so he does have.
Okay, here's your first question, Lane.
I'm unsure of the the watts that they have, but I do know that they utilize some of their extra electricity generated for the Bitcoin mining.
Okay, write down. He did a great job on his first question.
His first question.
So that just seems like a huge policy decision for us as a council to work through. Very complicated. Today, what's the steps if somebody wanted to hook that system up into our grid?
Yeah. Before something like that would happen, and don't look at them as all negative. Cedar Falls, to their credit, have been able to reduce their electric rates based on the revenues generated by this load. And there are some benefits to the system, such as they interrupt their load with a 5-minute notice. So they're not hitting new peaks, but you're selling a lot of energy. In terms of the process that council would be included on, we would have to create a new rate because they typically want to tie into the energy market rates. So it would be like a cost plus something. They typically pay for their own infrastructure, so they may even build their own substation. There are, I'll say benefits, but they offer things like they'll pay 2 months in advance, knowing that there's some bad reputation out there that people will build something and skip towns. But long and the short of it, we would come to council with a rate design and with criteria for this unique type of customer if that were to come to fruition.
And I'm trying to be open-minded on these things. Is that something that do you think there's value for us putting on an agenda at some point to have that conversation so we have that policy in place, or do we just wait until the tide brings in a proposal?
Kind of want to do both. I mean, I'd like to have a specific customer because if it's something that we are encouraging and want to set a policy that protects our other customers, protects the city, I'd like to hear what that load is bringing. But I wouldn't want to create a policy if there's not a need or a desire to have a customer of that type.
Okay.
So do they drop off so we don't set a new peak demand?
Right, like during the summer.
Yes. So there, and this is way off on a tangent.
Yeah,
this has nothing to do with tonight's
Short answer
presentation.
is fine. If the answer is yes,
They drop off, so they don't set new peaks, and they're there basically. In some ways, you'd think we have plenty of room on our wire. We have plenty of room on transformers and things like that, and so they're utilizing they're utilizing a resource that there's room on, as long as they're not setting new peaks.
Right. That's
kind of the core.
That's all I need to know. Thanks.
Okay. All right. The first study we had done is we hired HDR to do a life assessment of our Unit 7 and 8, the two base load natural gas fired generation. Much like you'd bring your car into a local repair shop, we've asked them to look at probably about 2,000 different elements within the power plant and just give us a green, yellow, red. Just real quick. So least concern, if it's something that well-maintained, it's going to last for a while. We don't anticipate it breaking down. It'll last 5, 10, or even beyond that. Moderate concern, you start looking at that equipment and say, okay, it could fail in 5 years, but we believe it'll keep going for about 10 years, up to about 10 years. And then critical concern then is it's something that we start worrying about. Just like you'd have in your car if you've got a low tire. Now the next screen is going to be, it's going to look, well, let's just go there. All right. The chart is important, but please don't focus on the chart because we've redone it on the left-hand side to tell you what those ones in red are. So least concern are green things, moderate concern are yellow, and then the red concerns are the critical. So focusing more on the left, I'll explain what the chart is intending to do. So this unit was built, like we said, in 1967, 58 years old. The left column are the specific systems, and we include the boiler, we include what's called the exciter, we include the stack that comes up, we include the transformer, for example. It's called a GSU. The X's that are not highlighted are only in those areas, like on the moderate concerns on draft fans, just because of their age. They're 58-year-old equipment. The ones that are highlighted are the ones that the consultant looked at and says, you got to think about this. So on Unit 7, the critical concerns, those ones in red, are the boiler tubes. As you know, we burn refuse-derived fuel. In the last 5, 6, 7 years, we replaced all those tubes with that Inconel-coated tubes. We continue to wear them out, but so it's a concern. The turbine generator overhaul itself, an exciter, basically it's, again, and maybe I should point out, typically generating units are built for about 30 years. You can push them to 40. We're pushing ours to about 60 years. So we're doing, the staff is doing a great job maintaining, but it's getting older. I have a car that's about that age and it runs okay, but I only run it on weekends, and it's got almost everything is brand new in it again. So the condenser, circulating water piping, and then the main transformer. Interestingly enough, the main transformer that was bought for this unit actually failed early on, and we got a replacement back in the, I think, 75, 76, and that was a used transformer when we got it. So I believe this transformer is like 68 years old that we have there right now. The transformer is a single point of failure, if you will. If that transformer goes, that's how you get the power out of the plant up to the grid, and it's not like they're sitting around waiting to replace it. They're typically 2 years to replace, something like that. So if you look at Unit 7, there are basically 5 main points that are somewhat critical. I'm going to just bring up the Unit 8 chart in comparison. So Unit 8 will be on your right. Really, the two pieces there are the boiler tubes and the generator step-up, or GSU transformer. Similar age, single point of failure. The transformer here is only put up there because it is because of its age. But as you can see, hopefully you can see, is that Unit 8 is in much better health right now than Unit 7 is. All right, so what does this mean? Let's quickly hit the high points. Unit 7 will be 60 years old in 2027. Interesting point, the repairing and replacing of the equipment just labeled under critical concern would cost 2/3 of the cost of putting in a brand new Unit 7. All right, we still haven't dealt with any of the moderate concern type things. And you're taking an old unit, bolting on, if you will, certain, like a brand new transformer, you're putting in new boiler tubes again, things like that. You still have other old equipment tying onto it. Another way of saying it is, if you're going to spend 2/3 the cost to just repair and replace, you might as well start looking at new, because there's other benefits that come from that. And then after completing RDF operation, the boiler will need some significant repair to continue operation for the long term. Looking at Unit 8, okay. Unit 8 is old, 43. Lane is younger than 43, but the rest of us are starting to approach that 43. Most of the equipment is in good repair. And again, units are designed and built for 30 years, possibly 40 years of operation. But there are units out there that can go longer if you're doing the right maintenance. Burning refuse-derived fuel is extremely hard on a boiler compared to burning coal or natural gas. We're going to need to continue the maintenance plans to extend the life another 10 plus years. The less refuse-derived fuel we burn in the boiler, the longer these tubes will last. So it's important. Then the smaller number of hours operated, the longer unit can preserve for that capacity. And remember, Unit 8 was valued, if you will, at $4 million just this summer. So what does that mean for us right now in the near term? We're going to try to be burning refuse. Right now, 8 is burning RDF. We're going to keep that through the summer and keep burning as much RDF as we can. But after this summer, we're going to start looking at using Unit 7 as our primary RDF burning unit to try to preserve Unit 8 for as much as possible for as long as possible. We believe that when we're off RDF in 2027, that Unit 7 will not have much useful life left. We will evaluate it, but the boiler tubes are going to be that much more progressed. All of those other red items are going to be more worn, if you will. And so we are anticipating retirement of Unit 7 probably in the 5, 6, 7-year time frame. We'll be looking at, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, is building new thermal generation to replace Unit 7. We want to operate Unit 8 less often to preserve the capacity. And then longer term, Unit 8 isn't going to last forever either. We've got 10 to 15-year planning horizon where we would likely have to replace Unit 8.
Well, before you go on, what you provided us for Unit 7 was quite helpful. At some point, the old van needs to go, and it doesn't make sense to continue to repair it. But you didn't give that same analysis on Unit 8. So if we were to address the more serious issues with Unit 8, how does that compare in terms of the price of a new unit?
With Unit 8, as you saw, I can go back to that chart here, is, right. The two things, one is boiler and the other one is transformer. Again, so a transformer right now, a generator step-up unit transformer, that's probably a $2 million investment into that. If you had to look at boiler tubes again, I think the last time we did boiler tubes, I want to say it was probably a $10 million investment. And you're still tying on to a lot of equipment that is 43 years old. A lot of the fans and things like that are that old. The other thing, and I can address this in more detail, Unit 8 is a steam heating system. So in other words, it takes about 12 hours to start. It has a heat rate of a little over 11,000. And the more efficient units have a heat rate of closer to 7,000. The lower the number, the more efficient taking that same amount of fuel is to make electricity. So a Unit 8 running with today's gas is probably a $45 unit. A brand new unit that we'll talk about can probably generate the same amount of energy at about $30. So we also then start looking at operating costs and things like that. Unit 8 still has capacity value, but takes 12 hours to start. There are other components that we can talk about in just a second. So I may answer your question.
So, and you don't have to answer it right now. If we can just sort of put a pin in this. You make a very compelling case that we need to think about replacing Unit 7 sooner than later. What you didn't mention is the lost opportunity costs. So the dollars that we're not putting towards those repairs in Unit 7, we could be putting those dollars somewhere else. So, but you're, at some point, I would like to hear your thoughts on that same analysis with Unit 8.
Okay. And I'm going to touch on funding and CIP near the end, probably at maybe not a 50,000 foot level, but about a 5,000 foot level. So if I don't get to your question before I'm done, please ask it again. Let me get ahead here. Okay. Okay. All right. And I apologize for how much is on this slide. So then the next study. So we've evaluated the life of our existing two main units. We then went into a study, say, okay, what technology is out there that we should look at? Okay. So we hired, again, ironically, HDR to look at this. They performed a technology assessment, right? We wanted to look at what's the capital cost, what are the typical O&M costs, performance characteristics of these, and then how much CO2 they would be producing per megawatt. It's interesting to note, they call this a class 5 estimate. So these are just in orders of magnitude. It's not like they say it's going to cost this, you can write a check for it. So it's minus 50% or plus 100%. So it's just, you're looking at them relative to each other. It's not something you can go out and write a check for the next day. We wanted to look at different types of green resources. We looked at solar, wind, and batteries. You could say, well, what about nuclear? Nuclear is considered a green resource. However, the size, the cost, and the timing when nuclear is going to be an option. I've heard that Mid-American's looking at a unit, their earliest is like 2036. And again, looking at the age, and I think those units are in the 300, 350 megawatt range. Our peak is 138. We looked at 3 different types of thermal generation. The difference there, thermal generation, we can start and stop and things like that. We looked at reciprocating internal combustion engines. They're called RICE in our industry. I have pictures. It's really cool. We have simple cycle combustion turbines. We're familiar with these. That's the same thing that we have out at GT1 and GT2. And then you can get fancier with a combined cycle. And what they do is they take simple cycles, capture the waste heat that comes off of them, puts it into what's called a HRSG, which is basically, it's a heat capturing system, makes steam, and then power another turbine. So they become extremely efficient, but they're fairly expensive. In looking at what we want to replace short term, Unit 7 is about 33 megawatts, and we believe we have some growth in there at 20. So we need somewhere in the neighborhood of about 60 megawatts in the shorter time frame, and then ultimately, when 8 needs to be replaced, another 65. So we're looking long term over these next 15 years of maybe 120 megawatts of generating capacity. HDR sort of suggested 150 megawatts as the smallest combustion turbine. CC is combustion turbines. That's the fancier one. You don't get the right economies of scale if you look at anything smaller. The waste heat off of a simple cycle going into the HRSG, there's not enough heat there to make enough steam. So you got to go 150. So it's the combustion or the combined cycle is good. But it's interesting that Ames alone is not an ideal candidate for that, because that would be like everything all at once. Okay. And I'll touch on that too. All right. The green resources, everybody's familiar with it. Solar, wind, battery storage. The interesting thing in fact, I was meeting with a wind developer yesterday. The current size of wind turbines are about 4.5 megawatts. The ones that you see around here are 1.5. So they've gone up 3 times. The generating technology, the reciprocating engine, basically I think it's an 18 piston generator. Where this showed up in our industry, these are actually what powers things like tugboats, cruise liners, things like that. And I don't know if you can see it, but down in the middle on the left-hand side, there's a guy standing there. I don't know if you can. So you can see how big those units are. There's a little guy standing there, and that's how big these units are. Huge. The simple cycle combustion turbine is what we're familiar with, what we have out at the GT sites. And then the combined cycle, basically those 2 tall black boxes at the end is what's capturing the waste heat and creating that much more efficient unit. Why are these thermal generation? Why these options? Well, their ability to turn on and turn off very, very quickly. They provide heat rates, in other words, the ratio of fuel to power, that are very competitive in our market. Ours are 11.5. These are in the 7,000 to 8,000 range. Relatively low cost to install, easy to do maintenance. I mean, the RICE engine, you could basically use a truck mechanic for the majority of the parts there that are doing it. They can operate in a Midwest environment, and They're basically clean for the environment. You think, well, you're burning fossil fuels to run these, but these are much cleaner than even our existing generation with the electrostatic precipitators that we have. Just doing a quick comparison, I won't spend much time on here. A RICE unit can start to full load in 2 minutes or less. Think of it like some of the modern cars now. When you stop at a stoplight, your engine literally shuts off, and then you step on the gas and that engine starts up immediately. That's almost what these units can do. The way you capture that is you keep warm, if not hot water, circulating through them. So you keep them at about 120-degree temperature. It's not the starting and stopping that hurts a unit like that. It's the thermal cycling. So when you let it cool down and then let it start up again. So if you keep it at a fairly constant temperature, what you really need is probably an upgraded starter and, and batteries to start it up. Okay. So we have this generation. We have wind, we have solar, we have batteries, and we have the thermal generation. We then said, okay, how do these apply in Ames situations? So we hired a company called Bright Night. Council approved the contract back in September of 24. And these guys are amazing with what they do. So they've taken historical hour-by-hour data of Ames load. They've taken historical hour-by-hour of MISO load, gone backwards, and then they also extrapolated it forwards, and they ran over 800 scenarios looking at, well, if we had RICE engines, how would they operate? How often would they operate? When would they operate? With the pricing, if gas were more expensive, how would they operate? If it was cheaper, how would they operate it? If there's more wind, less wind. And so we took those 800 scenarios and reduced it down to basically the most probable, it's not really least cost, but the most probable 10 options with each of the technologies to look at. And I apologize for the busy, I want to talk about this first. So the first thing they did was they modeled our load. The numbers aren't significant, but it's how they treat them. It's the color coding. And let me explain here. Along the top is January through December. Along the left-hand side is the hours of the day. So they basically took 2022 data for Ames and then said, okay, typically for the first hour of the day in January, what's the load like? And then for the second hour of the day in January, what's the load like? And the color, red means it's typically higher, yellow, and then you kind of move to orange and then to yellow and then to green. So this is telling us what we already knew is that we're a summer peaking utility, and we typically peak somewhere in that, it's like June, July, and August with a little bit in May and a little bit in September. And it's in that 10 o'clock till 10 o'clock at night or 9 o'clock at night kind of range. That's what that red represents. So spring and fall throughout the evenings, customers' demand is a little bit lower. So you say, all right, let's overlay, what does wind look like compared to our load shape? So the second chart is how our wind farm is producing. As you can see, it's almost, I would say a mirror opposite, but it's diametrically opposed. We get the most wind early in the morning, late at night in the off summer season. This is not saying we don't want wind, but you got to keep that in mind when you're saying, I want to green our resources. We want enough wind and then enough solar. Solar looks to match our load a little bit better, but solar is 1/2 as efficient as wind. We can typically get 50% of the energy out of a wind farm. So if you build 10 megawatts, you're going to get 50% of that energy. On a solar farm, it's in that 22%, and that's just where we're at, cloud cover, nighttime, snow, things like that. So it's kind of telling. All right. The other thing that we did was we kind of plotted, this is Ames cities. The gray is our load profile across a given year. And then we threw in the average performance. So we kind of, through this modeling, we kind of were able to kind of right size for today, how much wind and solar can we bring into our resources to start making us more green. And it came out to about 63 megawatts of wind and about 26 megawatts of solar. That can be tweaked, but this was the number through those 800 scenarios that came out of it. Let's see. So you'd say, well, great. That blue and yellow put combined, you just double everything and you've met your load. It doesn't work that way. So this next graph, I really get excited about it, but many people kind of look at it and say, I don't know what you're talking about. The blue is our load, hour by hour, plotted for the entire year. And as you can see, when you get into the summer, way high spikes and then it drops. The orange represents what 63 megawatts of wind and 26 megawatts of solar would do. And what's significant here, several things. One is when you look at the summer, there's a lot of white space. So we're not meeting that. But more significant, it's probably in that March, April, you start seeing some orange spikes coming above the blue. And what that says is if you start adding more wind in this particular case to start filling in the white, we will start filling in the white, but you're going to shoot so far past your load, you're going to be making a lot of energy, not benefiting us, but just pushing it out into the market, unless you put batteries, and that's another whole complex thing. But and because batteries are another cost, it allows you to shift the energy, but and get some capacity. But so this is a significant graph that kind of says, for the environment right now, 63 and 26 seem to be a good place to set on the renewables. Okay. Some of the things that they thought about were, so the combined cycle, the only size unit you can do is 150 megawatts. We studied up to 8 RICE units, the reciprocating engines, and then 3 simple cycles, because each is about 50 megawatts. We assumed a 20-year life. We know that it's good for more than 20 years, but we wanted to look at least through the, if we have to borrow or when we borrow and how we did that. How we did a comparison, and I don't want to focus too much on this because, again, the purpose is relativity, not, oh my gosh, this is going to cost this much, because there's other factors that roll into this. But the industry uses something called the levelized cost of energy, okay? And that's the average cost per megawatt over the lifetime of the assessment of the asset. You assume operating, maintenance, debt service, fuel, etc. In comparison, our LCOE is about $90 per megawatt. So that's if you look at our existing facilities, right? We don't have built into this number what that value of capacity is, because that within the MISO region changes so much. So that's the one thing that's not in here. We also try to show how much the units would run, and this becomes an interesting question for staff and for council, because if we buy a unit that is so efficient, MISO's going to want to run it. If we're running it, we have less opportunity to green our resources. So if you have an expensive unit, it's not going to run. We buy more from MISO, we can put more wind in, but that doesn't help us. So again, trying to find that sweet spot in terms of the right capacity factor is also critical. Okay. Breathe for a second. So those 10 scenarios I talked about, let me briefly talk about this chart. So CC is that combustion or combined cycle. That has the lowest LCOE, but because it's an extremely efficient unit, it's going to run about 50% of the time. Okay. It's CapEx, and again, these are relative numbers. We'd have to wait and sit down and do much more analysis, is about $200 million, but you're buying 150 megawatts of generation. We then looked at a combined cycle with 50% wind and 50% wind and solar. The wind, I think, was 80, and the wind and solar was the 63 and 26. Let's see. And then just to test it, we said, what happens if we built enough green, even though we have the combined cycle, if we built enough green to be 100% renewable? So we ran that scenario. The next three are rice with the same breakdown, and then the last is combustion turbine. Let's see, what can I, as you look at rice and combustion turbines, they run considerably less. The LCOE goes up a little bit. The other thing, and I'm anticipating this question. Well, what happens if the current administration gets rid of the investment or the Inflation Reduction Act money? It would just drive all these LCOEs about $15 higher. One of the things, so you'd say, well, if a combined cycle is the way to go, it's got the lowest LCOE. The one thing that doesn't do for us, which is really what we need, is that's an all or nothing. You go out, spend a lot of money, and put in a great big unit. The CTs and rice, even more so, allow you to right size. If we're only replacing unit 7 in year 1 or in year 5, I guess, and you need a little bit of growth, you can put in 3 rice. At that point, then you reevaluate what's the next step to meet unit 8 or meet the next growth. You can't do it with a combined cycle because you've done it all at once. And that's one thing that this chart doesn't represent, is it doesn't look at the time value of money that you would invest in something like this. We then, going back to those operating guidelines, we kind of looked at, okay, are we serving the city's peak? All of them meet that. Are we have an N-2 redundancy to meet the electric load and stuff like that? Because they would all be located here, that meets that. When you look at keeping customers cost competitive, the ones that meet that are just the rice units and the CT. The combined cycle does not do, from a capital investment cost, you're too much money up front that you don't need. Does it limit overproduction of generation from green sources? The ones that look at 50% green wind or 50% green wind and solar meet those. And then which ones serve as much of the city's electric load with green energy without compromising the other guidelines? It ends up being those that we start looking at. All right. So, and all of this is leading up to, or led up to, how we built our capital improvement plan last fall. This is really the background information that we were developing as we were putting the CIP together. Couple things. So the potential site that we're looking at is the existing coal yard. Enough room there. It's located close to existing unit 7 and 8. It's 8 acres. We have easy access to the Ames plant substation, so we can tie right onto there. If and when the refuse derived fuel program goes away, we have an additional breaker that we can use, and there is a very large gas line that we conveniently put there when we converted unit 8 to natural gas. So it's the ideal location.
Well, we'd have a much larger conversation about that, but in terms, we're getting rid of the resource recovery plant with there's some odor, and it's not a magnet for development on Lincoln Way, right? But if we replace that with a system that's going to have, does it have much for noise? Are there any negative externalities to this?
Yeah. The units are not quiet. It's like running a great big old diesel engine. However, we're not planning on putting these things in a little metal building. It would be similar in nature to concrete walls that would have sound attenuation and things like that. And again, this isn't something we want to run every day. This would be run when it's cost effective to do so. And we're looking at maybe 20% of the time, most of the time in the summer, when prices are high and loads are high. But there is sound attenuation that can be done for these units. So kind of summarizing, and then I'll hit on the funding, because that's really the key question. You're probably saying, okay, Don, what's all this going to cost? Unit 7, we know it's going to need major maintenance after the RDF program is done. We got to retire that in less than 10 years, probably closer to 5 in that 2030, 2031 timeframe. We don't know what it's going to look like when we're done burning RDF. Unit 8 is aging. We got to continue to maintain it, but we got to start planning its retirement in probably less than 15 years. In looking at in trying to even get generation built, combined cycles right now have lead times of greater than 5 years. The combined cycle, that's the big 150. It's a large dollar investment, less flexible, and it says needs to run where you make your money, if you will, on that. You spend a large capital amount, but you run it and you make money off of its operation as much as you do meeting the capacity needs. The combustion turbines, same thing. Lead times are 5+ years. The good news is you can stage the build out. You only put in the ones that you need as your either unit 7 drops off or as your load grows. They're a little less flexible to run. They don't have as much heat rate, a better heat rate as the combined cycle. The reciprocating engines, short lead time. Cedar Falls just went out for bid. They're putting in 2 of these. I think they're going to they opened up their bids within the last month, and they're going to be delivered in 2026. There'll be some installation time periods, but 2 years, maybe 3. They're very flexible. You can start and stop them in 2 minutes. They have a good heat rate, and they are considered dual fuel. So we would burn natural gas predominantly, but in a pinch, you also have the capability then of running diesel fuel. The newer ones can also burn, if you could find it, like 40% hydrogen. So there's that possibility too. I don't know where you'd find enough hydrogen to run it. Okay. Let's see what's in here. Okay. Rice is the best right now fit for Ames based on the size, based on the flexibility, placed on how quickly we can get in here. In the CIP, and again, I'll touch on funding, we would look at building the first 60 megawatts. It would be considered roughly 3 units. These RICE units range in size from 18 megawatts to about 26 megawatts each. That would replace unit 7 and give us 20 megawatts for anticipated load growth. We think that the coal yard is a good spot based on where our infrastructure is. I understand it's closer to downtown, but we've had people looking at that site. Not much else you can do with that coal yard right now. And it is off Lincoln Way. It's not right up against Lincoln Way. We would look at then building an additional 60 megawatts, and this would likely be RICE units, but the beauty of this thing is you're not committing to anything beyond those first 3 units. You can reevaluate it. Maybe combustion turbine is better at that time, or something different to replace unit 8 if and when we get to that point. The beauty is we can continue to review that, update our schedule, update our needs, and see what new technologies are out there. And then we still want to build or contract for up to 63 megawatts of wind and 26 megawatts of solar to try to gain that 50% renewable energy mix. And this is all in that 2030, 2035 timeframe. So how do we pay for this? Okay. If you recall, I'll just kind of go over it again. Our current electric CIP passed by council in March included the funding for 3 RICE engines based on the costs, the rough costs that came out here, which replace unit 7, meets the expected load growth, has fast response time. Funding, we also have funding in there for substation ownership and a new transmission source, which further improves our reliability. And near the end of that 5-year plan, we had talked about up to $50 million investment in renewable generation. This is above, we have a contract for 36 megawatts right now that ends in 2029. We believe we can replace that contract and either get it at half price or get twice the amount of energy for the same price. The contract's out there for
funding is not there until we get off of the resource recovery. So
this is, I'm glad you said that, Steve.
We have to get.
So where is this funding coming from? And we worked very closely with our director of finance. a lion's share is the savings from the discontinuation of the waste to energy. We spend upwards of, $9 million a year, $1 million a month burning refuse-derived fuel that could be applied at other places. We have, I believe, council's already approved a 1.5% rate increase going into effect this year in November. The cost of service study, if we recall that, talked about maybe 1.5% rate increases over the next 5 years. Council hasn't acted on that. The only one that's out there right now is the 1.5%. That's how the CIP was done, is looking at just this. Mentioned current wind contract replaced in 2029. We believe we can get double the energy for the same price, or the existing price will drop in half. We've already, out of our CIP, cut long-term Unit 7 CIP projects, and our O&M for Unit 7 has been reduced. Looking out beyond 2030, staff can reevaluate the timing and best options on when Unit 8 would have to retire, how we would do that, and then how that would get funded.
We have to do a lot more work on the funding side, because it's not just the funding, it's the impact on rates you're going to know about. So we have to look at this a lot closer, and these are today's dollars, things like that. So you're going to have to get a better idea of what the impact will be on both those moves, increasing the capacity and then moving to more sustainability. Those combined together, we have to understand what that cost will be, and we'll work on that.
What we're showing here is the pie chart on the left is our current generation mix. So roughly 50% of the energy for Ames is coming off of our current generation, burning natural gas, and we again have to burn the natural gas to consume the RDF. So that's 50% of our energy. We get roughly 10% from our wind, about 30% from the MISO market, and about 0.5% from Ames Solar, and that includes both our existing solar project plus the energy we purchase from our retail customers, the excess. As this thing rolls out, we believe then our wind will grow to closer to 40% to begin with. Well, it's 40% solar and about 10%, 40% wind and 10% solar, which is about 50%. We could have about 30% of our energy still produced in-house, because it would be the cheapest resource at the time, and the wind isn't blowing and the solar isn't shining. And then we would get other energy sources from imports from the MISO market. So that's what it's kind of looking like. So the timeline right now, we just received the request for proposals from engineering services. This is the first step. So I think we have 6 or 9 firms that are interested in working through the design phase. So we're going to be evaluating those. We'll be coming to council here, and then, if not the first meeting in July, maybe the second in July, going over all of the engineering proposals, hire an engineer that will start looking at the design, looking at how we permit it, how we go into MISO, all of that type of stuff. We believe then by February of 2026, we'll get 3 engines on order in that time frame. We'll also then have to order transformers and switchgear. They're typically a 2-year lead time to order transformers right now. And then start constructing, hopefully fall of 2026, with commercial operations sometime 4 years from now in 2029.
Give me an idea of the cost of those 60 megawatts.
So the cost of the 60 megawatt,
now,
yeah,
off the top of our heads.
we have in the CIP about $84 million, which we would go out and bond for that. And again, how do you make the bond payments, Don? Well, a lot of the savings from the reduction in natural gas purchases that we can stop in 2027 would allow us to make those bond payments, and really don't need to raise rates much to do that. Those 1.5% basically stabilizes our fund balance, and then allows us to make the investments in wind and solar.
So
But that's just on the first unit. Then when we buy the next unit,
Yeah,
we won't have that savings to
it
leverage.
doesn't count the movement to solar or wind yet either. That's why you have to look a lot closer at this, okay?
does that 80-some million include the building too? Is that
That's-
just for the engines?
So right now, we're factoring in about 25 million for
How much?
25 million for each unit, and then the infrastructure and building would be the other $9 million.
Your chart shows issue contracts for construction November of next year, but not starting construction until almost a year later.
Oh. I'll have to look at that. I assumed it was in the spring of 2027 and not the fall, but we'll double check the schedule.
Okay. Well,
I can't give you a good answer on that, Mayor.
I think the point of the presentation is we're doing long-range planning, right? We've got kind of a vision where we want to go,
know which units to use.
what units to use. There's a lot been proven here.
Nope.
The cost and how we spread this out, how we pay for it, the exact timing, who knows about tariffs and what's going to happen, federal government money, credits. We don't know all that. But once you know we've got a plan, Don and the staff done a great job in the plan itself moving forward. We might have to adjust some of those for costs and things like that, but hope you understand where we're going to. We got to look ahead, and you can't look ahead when the Unit 7 craps out. We got to look ahead, and we're doing that. We're looking ahead in potential growth, so we continue to grow, right? And looking ahead on sustainability. And remember, we were talking about $50 million for sustainability. Remember that? So that's 50 million plus 85 million. So you can see we've got some work to do on this to make you feel comfortable with this.
This has been a great presentation, and I'm going to keep my questions also at the high level, not going to the weeds. It seems like when we're at a juncture like this, this is an important opportunity for us to think outside the box a bit. So I have an outside the box question. So we partner with Iowa State in so many ways. Would this be a situation where, because so much of this analysis is based upon scale and the volume of energy production, would there be some wisdom in reaching out to Iowa State and saying, we're going through this analysis, would you like to go with us? And would there be some economies of scale that would make sense for both Iowa State and Ames?
Possibly, but let me kind of give you the comparison. So we produce electricity to sell electricity. Iowa State's generation resources are there to make steam for heating and cooling the campus. So that's what they're doing. That's how they size their equipment. Any waste heat that comes off that, they throw into a generator and make electricity with it. So their energy is a secondary process to their heating and cooling. For us to build and they have enough capacity, like we were talking about before, to meet their electric needs. For us to build a unit, we would either then have to build it on their campus to make it beneficial for them and then tie the steam into their system. There's no value if we put a unit at the coal yard unless they need specifically electricity, energy and capacity. But their primary driver is steam for heating and cooling. Does that make sense?
It does, and I was aware of that, but do they see that as their long-term solution is steam indefinitely, or would they at some point convert to a different model?
I know some studies had looked at, for example, changing out their boilers to electric boilers, which would be incredibly expensive. I mean, that would get them off of burning natural gas, for example, for heating and cooling, or going into each building and putting in a separate air conditioner furnace and things like that. We can have those discussions with them again, but I think they're going to be on a totally different timetable than maybe we are in how their campus is heated and cooled.
Okay, and I just wanted to throw that out because they're such an important partner in so many ways. We've got this amazing URAB board. Could you walk us through the role of URAB in this process?
Sure. So this, along with a lot of other little projects that we've brought to council. So URAB has seen this presentation. We did it for them in the last 3 weeks. They'll be involved as we get our engineer on board and talking through that. But yeah, we have a meeting with URAB basically monthly, and we'll be continually to giving them updates. And they've raised some of the similar questions on, okay, why are we thinking about rice versus CTs versus combined cycle and things like that. We did not consider, I should mention, we did not consider coal, and we did not consider hydro in this area as other generation resources. Was briefly talked about, and we took those things out of the study process.
Well, this is a very exciting time for URAB to be on URAB and have a front row seat for this transition that we're going through in Ames. You haven't talked about the lifespan of our solar farm. Those things don't last forever, and those panels, at some point, is there a concern right now with obtaining solar panels, and wind generation is very controversial. There are counties that are banning the construction of new wind farms in Iowa. So I guess I'm not working in the presumption that wind is necessarily going to be easier going forward. Could you speak to just sort of the environment we're in terms of wind and solar?
Sure. From our solar farm perspective, basically built into any model, you assume about 0.5% of degradation across the year. So in a 20-year lifespan of a farm, you're probably going to lose 10% of its initial output. It's not that it drops to zero after that. You still start losing a little. Our contract with Forefront, who is our solar contractor, they have certain performance requirements. So if panels start dropping off sooner than that, and we're losing more of that output than what is prescribed, they're required then to come in and replace panels. The other thing we can look at, our contract is actually a 25-year contract with them. And we have within our contract the ability to purchase it from them virtually at any time. And we could take over ownership if that became a benefit to us, and then we could maintain it, put in new panels, change out panels, do things like that.
And could you go back to the slide? I still understand that. I think people are maybe surprised at it's a very small percentage that solar is providing, is 0.5%, 0.4%, something like that. How do we grow from the 0.4% up to 10%? I missed that.
So right now we have about 2 megawatt. We have a 2 megawatt solar farm sitting at the airport. So right now we're looking at probably adding about 26 megawatts, and it's 4, 5, 6 acres per megawatt. Key is to find the right land, find the right landowner, and then be able to tie it onto the system and get it back here. So 26 megawatts should get us about 10% of our energy.
And is that in our CIP?
Again, what we did was we put a 50 million, because we would like own it, so we do bonds. So we put a 50 million renewable generation target out there in 2029, 2030.
And the final question, I want to come back to the Unit 8. So I think you answered the question in your discussion, but just so I can repeat it back to you. In essence, you've done your cost benefit analysis on replacement and are just telling us now is not the time, that we can still duct tape and replace things as needed. And that cost benefit analysis, that there's a tipping point and we're not there yet with Unit 8 the way we are with 7. Am I saying that correctly?
That is correct. Now, with that said, there are a couple of critical pieces on both units. If that main transformer goes out and we have to look for a new transformer, do you sit there and buy a brand new transformer to replace one that's 50, 60 years old? Do you find a used one? So our desire is to keep Unit 8 healthy as long as it's operational. We can't just have a paperweight sitting there. We have to demonstrate to MISO and to ourselves that it has value. But the key is it doesn't have to run day in and day out. It has to start when we need it, and then that serves our capacity needs. Hope I answered your
Yep,
question.
no, that's great. Thank you very much for answering my questions.
Any other questions?
Yeah, so Don, looking at this long-range plan, at what point does the current electric services building simply become a giant sarcophagus for the dead Unit 7 and dead Unit 8? And are we tying ourselves to that building unnecessarily by using the coal plant, or the coal yard land for the construction of the new building to house the rice units?
Good question. All right. So today in the existing power plant building that we're talking about, we have a retired Unit 5 sitting in there, a retired Unit 6, and then we have operational Unit 7 and operational Unit 8. So for sure, as a minimum, we need to continue that building through the useful life of Unit 8. Now, I think, Gloria, what we're looking at for the rice units are not to be put right now in that building. There's so much 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, 80s, etc. stuff in there. We would spend more time tearing out existing stuff to fit rice units in there. So the intentions are to go to the coal yard, start over, do it right. You basically build a building and you go Unit 1, Unit 2, Unit 3, probably have a control room over there. And then if and when you need it, put in Units 4, 5, and 6 when you're replacing 8. Then at that time, 15 years down the road, then we look at, okay, how do you either repurpose the building, or maybe at that time, it's not rice units that we're putting in, and you look at Units 5 and 6 as a place to put the combustion turbine. Again, I don't want to say we're kicking the can down the road, but we're not at a point where we need to say, what should we do with the building? We have a nice break point after we replace 7, and we've met our capacity obligations that we could have 3 units sitting on the coal yard and something unique at the old plant. I'm not at a point where I want to make that decision when we close the existing building.
So by building the new building for however many rice units you want to put in, are we locking ourselves into that location for electric services for many decades to come? And is it possible to be putting those units elsewhere? I don't understand whether the proximity to the current electric service building is essential, or whether it's just the fact that we've got the coal yard. It's a big empty piece of land that we could currently build on.
It has to do with the transmissions that would start from there too, right?
Correct. So yeah, couple things. So the coal yard, interestingly enough, is not next to the power plant. The coal yard's actually on the south side of the track. So I don't want to say it's a brand new virgin land, but it's a piece of property that has still coal on it. We'd have to clean that off. We would be starting a new structure there. And yes, Gloria, we would be committing the city to a power plant near the downtown area for 30, 40 years. I think Bronwyn brought up an excellent point. So what we need to do is we have to tie it onto our electric grid. So the low cost, easy way to do that is Ames plant substation, which most people don't see, sit east of the plant, east of the old water plant, and kind of down the hill. That's where we need to get the power to. So let's say we said, let's hypothetically move generation outside of the city limits. then you'd be building two major transmission lines to tie into that point to get the power back to the grid, driving up costs. But if that, yeah, we haven't contemplated moving the generation anywhere. We looked at the coal yard as an ideal location based on the transmission system and access to the grid.
Is there any value to, when you hire the engineer to do an evaluation of, is there any land which is closer to your substation that could be procured to build this unit? 'Cause I mean, obviously you got that a lot of money put into the substation, but I know we got some cells there for the
Ash Pond.
The ash pond there. I just didn't know if there's anything else. Is that going to be an evaluation, or is it just already assumed that we're just going to do it in the coal yard? I'm just thinking that, you know, they have that farm ground down there. We don't own it, but this could potentially be an essential corporate purpose for the city. If that would, is that going to be part of evaluation that this engineer might look at also, or you're going to just?
Yeah, our general focus was on the coal yard for the benefits that we've seen in that, but we can definitely add that as an alternative. I'm trying to think of some of the values of the farm ground. I think that floods
So you
at
think the farm
time.
ground off 13th Street?
Yeah,
That's a floodplain there, remember?
yeah, but
Yeah, we could look at that, but I don't know.
I didn't know. You
We-
built up. I'm just
we
saying
will-
that,
We could look at it.
Yeah,
and it may be totally infeasible. I just didn't know if that was part of the scope of work or it was
Yeah.
already.
we will definitely have our engineers look at that and at the very least evaluate the site we're talking about. And if there's any other better site that's either low cost or more beneficial, we could have that included in the study.
I mean, I agree with Gloria. I think this is a time to look at that. And certainly there's a great argument in terms of just the ease of just adding on to what you have now. But in terms of city planning and what might happen with that land, would give us a lot more options if that wasn't there. I mean, if we were to build a city from scratch today, we wouldn't put the electrical utility in the middle of town. We wouldn't do that, right?
Right.
So now it seems like the time to put a fresh set of eyes on that, and you just sort of figure out what the cost of that would be.
Mhm. Okay. We will take a look at that too. Giving me some things to think about.
Well, in long term, if you get power plant goes away, so to speak, all the vapor from the cooling in the middle of the winter that causes, you know, issues, that dispels. The resource recovery plant, you know, goes away. That might make that area, you know, east of Duff potentially more attractive for some, you know, redevelopment, you know, long term. But I think we've exhausted that point tonight. I think you can look at it and it may become totally impractical to do that too.
Okay.
All right. Anything else? Other questions?
Yeah, no actions needed.
Right. All right.
Thank you all for your time.
Lane, great job tonight. I hope you aren't sweating bullets there, but
Our meetings normally go till 9, just so you know.
usually the workshops end at 8. It's almost 9, but anyway. So just saying. All right.
Welcome.
All right. Council comments. Rachel, anything tonight?
Nothing for me tonight.
Tim?
The Juneteenth celebrations Saturday, I think, was a great success. Every year it gets better. Our Vanessa Baker Latimer was a key player in that, but she wasn't the only one. And maybe, Anita, you know the other players in this. Letitia Faisal was involved, and there were some other key people in that organizing. But I just met a lot of people that I hadn't met before, and I think that's one of the benefits of something like that. So hats off to the organizers for that.
Amber?
And just to piggyback, just to thank the city, because city was out in force for this, and so it was great having that support. Also today, Habitat for Humanity, they have 3 more housing units. There was an open house there today. Around 50 high school students have participated in that building project from not just from Ames High, but the entire area. So excited to see. and to see what's happening, the opportunities for young people associated with our city work. So that's it.
Rama?
Nothing for me. Thank you.
Gloria?
I was just thinking when we were talking about the transportation plan and Tim was considering the number of people who are coming into Ames or going out of Ames for work. At the Alliance board meeting the other day, we actually heard some statistics from Boone that if you take, let's say, the number of people who live in Boone and work in Boone as a number around 1,500, there are approximately 2 times that many people who come into Boone but don't live in Boone to work, and approximately 3 times that number who are leaving Boone to go and work elsewhere. And so just on that smaller scale, the number of people who are coming in and out of a community does have a significant impact on the traffic patterns and the way in which we need to think about our development of roads. So I appreciate the planning that went into the AMPO meeting tonight, and just it made me think it'd be nice if we had that data for Ames. That's all.
Thank you. I think there's some kind of event out at SunSmart Ames tomorrow. Is that correct?
Correct. We're having a tour going out to the solar farm. I think it's from 4 to 6. Nolan texted me today with the pending weather, though. We may have a rain delay and do that then on Thursday. So Nolan's going to check his crystal ball and see if tomorrow still works.
All right. And then I'll just add that on Thursday at 8:45 in the morning, I'll be joining a contingent over in Putuebo, Kosovo. We're going to be doing a signing of the agreement for our second sister city. Council, I think I mentioned this a few weeks ago. If you're interested in participating in that virtually, let me know. I can send you the link. And both Carla McCollum, the president of AIPCA, and Cindy Hicks, our past president, are over there right now representing us. And we had a signing ceremony of the documents that those got sent with them. And so I'll be joining the mayor, and there's quite a contingent of people from Iowa that are there. And so we'll be memorializing our second sister city agreement. So if you're interested, let me know. I'll get you the link. I understand it's during the workday for a lot of you, and it may not be convenient. They have reserved a slot from 8:45 to 10:45, so I'm not sure if it's a 2-hour-long ceremony or if it's more or less just other events going on. So with that, entertain motion to adjourn.
Move we adjourn.
Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All right,
Hi.
we are adjourned. Thank you.
You all got a memo on